Right. So, of course, people are currently joining us and people will continue to join us throughout today. So to those of you who are already in, thank you guys so much for being here today. I'm really, really excited for today's webinar, and I really hope that you guys get a lot out of it. So I just want to do a quick little bit of housekeeping before we get started into our actual remarks. Okay, so first of all, my name is Elena, and I'm the training officer with ASCERT. I will not go into too much about myself yet because I am one of your speakers today, but I'm also your host. Got a couple of hats on, so you guys will get to hear a little bit more about me towards the end of today's webinar. So first of all, just to let you guys know, our chat function is not enabled for you guys, but we do have Q&A. So if you are interested in asking any speakers any questions today, as you can see on the schedule in front of you, we do have designated Q&A sections. So if you are, feel free to type out your questions into the Q&A as the person is speaking, but then they will address your questions at the end at their designated Q&A time. We have all tested our equipment, so there shouldn't be any sort of technological difficulty, but I do thank you in advance for your patience in the event that there is any sort of difficulty with technology. As well, a recording will be available after today's session, so if you need to pop away at any point, I know you guys are all really busy, a recording will be made available to you after today. There is a poll right now that is launched that is just to let us know where you guys are currently sitting in regards to your understanding and your practice where it comes to trauma and trauma-informed practice. So if you could answer those questions for me, that would be fantastic. Other than that, if you do have questions with your volume or anything like that, you should have a button on your toolbar or that shows a little maybe headphones or microphone. If you click your arrow that is next to that, you should be able to choose different inputs or outputs for sound. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Aidan Dawson. He is the Chief Executive Officer for the Public Health Agency, and he will be delivering our opening remarks. Aidan, over to you. Oh, you're muted there, Aidan. Sorry.
Gosh, and how often have I been told that over the last number of years? Thank you, Elena, and welcome everyone. It is great to see you all here this morning, and heartening to see so many people on screen for this, what is an important event, and what I will also hope is an informative event. I'm told we've just over 400 people registered for this morning, which is obviously great to see. Which highlights the keen interest across Northern Ireland in developing a trauma-informed approach. As Chief Executive of the Public Health Agency, I'm heartened by people's commitment to attend today's session. For some of us, the information we hear today will be new, and for others, what we hear will help organise our existing knowledge, skills, and experience, and perhaps stimulate some additional creativity in our thinking. All of us, no matter our role, can benefit personally and professionally from a trauma-based approach. This morning, we will hear about the various strategies supporting a trauma-informed approach, with many of you working diligently to realise the visions and ambitions of various local strategies, such as the mental health strategy, the substance abuse strategy, and the Protect Life 2 strategy. And that's just a few of them that are out there. While some of our local strategies are implicit in their support of the trauma-informed approach, others are explicit in developing a trauma-informed approach. However, this work is bigger than any single strategy and needs to be considered in the context of developing a trauma-informed nation in Northern Ireland. We have committed leaders working collectively to develop such a trauma-informed nation, many of whom are here today. When I mention trauma, I consider the following definition adapted from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration USA, 2014. Trauma refers to experiences that cause intense physical and psychological stress reactions. This may be from a single event, multiple events, or a set of circumstances experienced by an individual as physically and emotionally harmful or threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's physical, social, and emotional or spiritual well-being. Our approach in health and social care should be grounded in the understanding that trauma can impact an individual's neurological, biological, physiological, and social development. Our approach should be guided by the 4 key elements, the 4 R's of trauma-informed care. Realize the impact of trauma on an individual, groups, and communities. Recognize the signs, symptoms, and widespread impact of trauma. Respond by integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices, and resist and prevent re-traumatization. Today's speakers will speak to the key elements of a trauma-informed approach and much more as we hear about the benefits of and strategies for becoming a trauma-informed organization, how we can support the well-being of the workforce, and how we can utilize a practical trauma-informed toolkit for practitioners working with children and families. As this morning's workshop progresses, I would encourage you to consider some key questions to support creative thinking. Firstly, what are your thoughts around trauma and trauma-informed practice? How does this relate to your area of work? What do you think trauma-informed practice might look like for you in your role? What would you need to support you in becoming more trauma-informed? And without further delay, I would like to welcome the introductory speaker, Orla Connolly from Safeguarding Board NI. Thank you. Orla.
Right, thank you very much, Aidan. Can everyone see my slides okay? Yeah, okay. So good morning, everybody. And as Aidan said, there's absolutely fantastic to see such interest today, and really people thinking about this as something that either they want to know more about or really thinking about how they can play a part. So I'm one of the implementation managers in the Safeguarding Board, and the Safeguarding Board in recent years has really been, I suppose, really considering how we can support implementation across the whole system in terms of thinking about developing trauma-informed practice. For some of you who may know me, prior to coming into this role, I worked for 3 years in terms of supporting the coordination of the PLIG group in the Southern Trust area. And obviously then I would have also periodically attended some of those DAC meetings as well. So I think events such as this, really looking at that alignment between PLIGs and DACs, so many of the stories of individuals that I would have supported who had been impacted by a death by suicide, very often there was underlying unresolved and significant trauma. And, you know, we're capturing deaths. People, you know, are down. We capture it as a death related to suicide, as a death related to, you know, perhaps drug and alcohol. But I think, you know, considering this whole field of trauma-informed practice, it is absolutely relevant to every one of us. And in many ways, you know, when we're looking at trauma-informed practice, the SBNI in recent years, as a collective, the SBNI is a collective group of organisations of which the PHA are part of. And it's really recognising that our early experiences matter, and that all of us really, you know, can play a part in recognising the imprints of childhood adversity and trauma. And this is a key part of achieving better outcomes, really really across the whole system in Northern Ireland. And from a trauma-informed practice point of view, we're really thinking about the prevalence of adversity and trauma. That, you know, when we understand this and coming from that trauma perspective, it can really help us understand the responses and needs of the people we work with. So many people, we look at those adaptive coping strategies where individuals are using substances to cope with overwhelming pain. But trauma-informed practice also can help us think about our own responses and needs and really thinking about how we support our workforces. So when we're talking about trauma-informed practice, we're really needing to focus not only on the people who seek our support, but equally on the people and the systems that provide that support. So when, you know, we're talking about trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed approaches, we're really talking about this can only happen when we have trauma-informed environments, policies, systems and organisations. And really, so what we're looking to look at is this whole systems approach. And in many ways, what we're saying is we're all on this journey. This is a journey toward becoming a trauma-informed organisation. It's a whole system approach. And some of, you know, the situations and the circumstances, you know, that so many of us are working with, you know, I genuinely believe that if we have communities that are trauma aware, they can better support people who are in distress. They can recognise the importance of people being connected. If we have workplaces that are able to recognise and proportionately respond to trauma, and equally as well, that we have, you know, those communities, those workplaces and that trauma-informed practice, it is absolutely key. And what I would also say is the Safeguarding Board is on this journey, as are all their member agencies. So for me, trauma-informed practice is almost this incremental journey, this putting together the pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and really looking to enhance and embed our understanding of trauma and our understanding of trauma-informed practice, and really considering, you know, how do we each continue within our organisations to consider what is my area of influence, where can I play a part in this. So, as I said, the SBNI, the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland, is a collective. It is a group of organisations who are involved in the protection and well-being of children. And it is this, you know, these are the 21 member agencies of the SBNI, of which the PHA, the community and voluntary sector, are absolutely core members. And the SBNI conducts business by committees and panels, and one of those committees is the Trauma-Informed Practice Committee. And there are currently 11 organisations that are part of that Trauma-Informed Practice Committee. And we have Maurice Meehan from the Public Health Agency, who is representing the Public Health Agency on that committee. So since 2017, some of you may know that the SBNI received 1.5 million as part of the Early Intervention Transformation Project. And what at that time was, there was a huge investment cross-departmentally looking at building professional workforce capacity. And some of you will be familiar with some of the regional ACE conferences. And if you want to hear more about any of that, there are summary reports, there are presentations, there are slides, there's a summary video of those ACE conferences to really hear about where each of those organisations are at and continue to be in terms of their trauma-informed practice journey. Some of the other work the SBNI have been involved in is a leadership programme, Be the Change, in collaboration with the HSC Leadership Centre. And I think there were 50 to 60, you know, leaders across organisations as part of that, really thinking about how do we embed trauma-informed practice within our organisations. ASCERT here are our partners in delivering the level 1 and level 2 modules. So there's almost 500 trainers across Northern Ireland who are trained, you know, to deliver either the level 1 ACE awareness or the level 2 developing trauma-sensitive approach. That's also available in terms of some of the online modules. SBNI have a range of resources. All of these are freely accessible as well on our website. So really thinking about For example, understanding the impact of trauma on brain development. That's something that is, that may be of interest to some people today. And these are some of the resources that are available to support people on their journey. One of the, we've heard Aidan there mention, SAMHSA, and certainly the work in the SBNI has been influenced by SAMHSA, by Trauma-Informed Oregon, by looking at international models of best practice in implementing trauma-informed organisations. And, when we're looking at this, we are using what's called a transformation model. And what this is really embedding SAMHSA 6 principles and SAMHSA 10 domains. And the 6 principles there, we will see are how can we ensure that all our work, we're really thinking about safety, safety for our service users and safety for our staff. And we're thinking about safety. Safety is not the absence of threat, Gabor Mate tells us, it's the presence of a connection, and really thinking about that is so protective. We know that individuals who have experienced trauma find it difficult in terms of trusting other people. So trust is absolutely important, that in our relational interactions, we're able to provide experiences that often contradict kind of previous experiences of individuals. Peer support. We know that isolation is one of the most stressful experiences for us as human beings. So how can we support each other and make sure that no one is alone with their distress and their trauma? So all those principles of empowerment, of choice, collaboration is absolutely fundamental when we are thinking about trauma-informed practice. So basically what we're saying is we want, when we're thinking about understanding trauma-informed practice, we're looking at how do we have the principles of trauma-informed practice, and then how do we look at implementing this? How do we look at a service user's journey, perhaps from entry to exit, which is essentially what the SIM model, which is mentioned there, is looking at. And if people want to maybe hear, somewhat more about this, they can take a look at, for example, there are some reports available, and this is an example of one from the Salvation Army, and it's a pilot project, and really looking at how they looked at those principles of trauma-informed practice, looking at that implementation and how they looked at implementing that within their organisation. In terms of the current Trauma-Informed Practice Committee, what we are talking about at the minute is we have a work plan for this year, and the 3 areas that we are looking at in that work plan, firstly, is an update of the evidence review. Some of you may be aware that in 2018, Queen's University Belfast were commissioned to really look at what are the key messages for developing trauma-informed practice in Northern Ireland across sectors. And, there are various reports available. These are all on our website, and there were specific reports for education, justice, child welfare, and specifically for health and the mental health system. So we're asking Queen's University to, at the moment, we have new research commission that should be available later in the summer, to really look at where we're at in Northern Ireland. What are the barriers? What are the enablers? And look at international examples of best practice, and what more can we do to really fully embed and implement trauma-informed practice in Northern Ireland. The second area of the work plan is really looking at this idea of communications. How do we have a common language when we're talking about trauma-informed practice? Because we have trauma-informed practice, trauma-sensitive practice, trauma-informed approaches. So again, how can we really look at supporting organisations to have this explicit commitment to trauma-informed practice? So one of the things we have looked at, which is actually going to be put up on the website this week, we have an online training brochure, and really within this brochure it is looking at supporting individuals, where they can access the level 1 and the level 2 online modules, and we know they're freely available for any practitioner across Northern Ireland. For people who are looking to enhance their level in trauma, we also have the Sully Hall approach, and they have 4-hour trainings in understanding trauma, understanding brain development, and understanding attachment. Then we're really mindful that when we're thinking about trauma-informed practice, it is supporting the workforce. Stress people can't regulate stress people. So we have working in high pressure environments, and there are specific modules available for people working within healthcare, police, social care, and the fire service. And again, there are links to some of the training pathways and some of the resources. That's an outline of the Understanding Trauma module, and that's an outline just of the Understanding Your Wellbeing in High Pressure Environments. And again, these are freely available. Finally, the last area of the trauma-informed practice work plan this year is really looking at how do we support organisations and individuals to realise that trauma-informed practice is something that links with existing priorities. This isn't something new, this isn't something different. And what we are developing at the minute is an online trauma-informed organisational toolkit. And what we are doing is really looking at each of the domains, each of those SAMHSA domains. So we're looking at leadership, government, policies, procedures, looking at our physical environments, looking at, you know, cross-sector collaboration, you know, which is a fantastic example here today of cross-sector collaborations, and looking at that interface between the PLIGs and the DACs. So we're looking at all of these areas, and we're going to put together an online toolkit to really look at how can we support staff in making trauma-informed practice tangible, and really supporting individuals and organisations. What does this look like when it's fully embedded? How do we get there? You know, what is the contribution of a trauma-informed approach for our organisations? And really this message is, you know, how do we support people to realise that we can all play a part in this whole area of trauma-informed practice? So at the minute, what we are doing is, some of you may have seen this, and Kevin kindly circulated this, you know, across kind of the PHA and PLIGs and DACs. We are asking for examples because we want to share the learning, and we're asking all organisations if anyone would like to contribute, if anyone would like to share any examples of trauma-informed practice. They don't have to be completed, they don't have to be finalised. It could be an extract from someone, it could be a pre and post photograph of a physical environment. We have a welcoming first point of contact. So we're inviting all organisations across sectors to contribute to this, and to contact either myself or Sheena to really share any examples to contribute to this online toolkit, which hopefully will be available in the coming months. Certainly we're happy for anyone to get in touch with us. Here's our contact details. And I suppose I just want to finish by saying it is so heartening to see so many people here today who are really interested in thinking about, you know, how they can play a part in terms of trauma-informed practice. We're all on this journey. We're all on different points. Some people are at the start of this journey. Some people are thinking, what more can I do? And I suppose what we're trying to think about is, how do we support organisations for this to be tangible without overwhelming them in terms of thinking about where can I start? Where is the best place for me? And in many ways, it's about taking one step forward. It's not about doing it all at once. It is incrementally thinking about what is the right place, the right starting point for me. Is it collecting our trauma champions together? Is it getting an implementation team? Is it enhancing our understanding and really focusing on training? So again, you know, feel free to get in touch if anyone wants to find out more in relation to the work that the SBNI and the Trauma-Informed Practice Committee are doing in this area. But it is absolutely key, the whole concept of we can all play a part, and cross-sector collaboration. So thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much for that, Aidan and Orla. So go ahead and open up to questions. So if anybody has any questions for either Aidan or Orla about strategy, where it comes to regional stuff, SBNI specific, PHA specific, please feel free to put those in, and we'll give people about a minute or so. Do any of the panelists have any questions for Aidan or Orla? Yeah, happy enough. So again, it's really heartening to see, of course, that Northern Ireland, you know, we do have strategies and things like that to address trauma-informed practice, which is really, really, really great to hear. So thank you guys so much for that. So as we are, let's give it a another little bit here, but what we will do, so I'll give another little minute to see if any questions come through. But after that, we will take a quick break. So first of all, I will open this up to, like I said, Aidan, Orla, or Kevin. I think you guys would be well placed to answer this question. So Gail Smith there says, hi, can I ask what a PLIG and DACT is? This is new to me, so I'm unaware of the terminology. So if you guys would like to explain, we'll go to Kevin.
Yeah, maybe I take that, Elena. So,
Sure.
great question. We talk in acronyms in health and social care, understandably. A PLIG is a Protect Life Implementation Group, and regionally there are 6 PLIGs. So there's a regional PLIG, which is chaired by the CMO, and then there are 5 PLIGs that are co-terminus with each trust locality. And essentially those are collections of community, voluntary and statutory providers, including individuals with lived and living experience, who engage to deliver and implement the suicide prevention strategy in Northern Ireland. And the DACs are local drug and alcohol coordination teams, and again of a similar nature. There is one for each trust area, so 5 in total, and they are made up of community, voluntary and statutory organisations as well, and then they also feed into the substance use accountability structure, which has a programme board, an advisory board and 10 outcome groups then as well.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. Claire Hall asks, will there ever be dual diagnosis within Northern Ireland?
I maybe jump in there, Elena, if anybody is happy to answer. In terms of the process of dual diagnosis, we have a range of services that are currently existing in practice across community, voluntary and statutory providers that do actually work for people who are deemed to have what is a dual diagnosis, a co-occurring mental health and substance use issue. Now, when you talk to colleagues right across, for example, our addiction colleagues that are working in Tier 3 and Tier 4 in trust-based services, they will absolutely inform us that there are a range of people who might be presenting with a core issue around substance use of some description, but that is more often than not accompanied by a mental health problem or issue, which may or may not be diagnosed. So in reality, we do have a range of services in each trust locality that are currently operating and supporting people with co-occurring conditions of both mental health and substance use issues. Could there be more? Quite probably. And could we do it better? Absolutely. And I think that's what today's conversation is about. How do we ensure that we can do that by presenting, meeting the needs of those people who present with services when they have those issues, but also thinking, as Orla and Aidan had pointed out there, about that early preventative work. How do we really get upstream and really prevent people from needing those type of services in the first instance? And we need to think about prevention and early intervention, as well as access to high quality treatment and services. And importantly, and as part of that process, a recovery oriented ethos within all of our work.
Thank you so much for that, Kevin. The final question here appears to be, second to final. So somebody asked if Orla is willing to share her slides.
Yes, absolutely. No problem, Elena. I can forward those across, and even the link to the brochure as well, yeah.
Yes, perfect. So I will say as well, I'm having a look at some of these questions. Some of these might be for, we might need to follow up with us because they might be a bit more than we can unfortunately discuss in our very brief time period here. So for example, so are there any plans to develop a generic information pack for those who have experienced trauma? There's a plethora of information out there from many sources, but I'm specifically wondering about a source written or online information for those who we are working with to aid their understanding. So for individuals, I suppose, say maybe service users, clients, whatever phrase that you want to use. Those are, if there's anything that anyone can think of off the top of their head, but I feel like that one might be more of a, we have to go away and take a look at that and to have a think about that. Or I see you're unmuted. Did you have?
No, I mean, I think it's really important because I think, there is recognition, there are lots of pockets of great practice, lots of, service, resources. But in terms of sometimes pulling everything together, I think that's where this, kind of cross-sector collaboration is so important, and to really look at what are gaps, because often what I find, having worked, you know, within various services, so many of the same themes are recurrent. So if there's a sense, because what we're trying to do in terms of the SBNI, our focus is in trauma-informed implementation of organisations. It's not those trauma-specific services. So if we're really thinking about, you know, collectively that people are feeling this is something, you know, because often I find, and I think that's where the plagues and the DACs of bringing all those information together, you know, looking at what the community and voluntary sector have, looking at what statutory services, and there is something about how do we reduce this fragmentation? How do we have this collective kind of centralized, really looking, you know, at the different resources? And I think it's absolutely key that we break down what does trauma-informed practice mean for our service users, for our service recipients, and really supporting people that this information is really accessible, because so much of what people are dealing with, they may feel it's a personal weakness, but when we can reframe that into this an adaptive coping strategy, this is your nervous system that is overwhelmed. So I think, you know, I'm not saying there's one resource, there's lots of resources, you know, in terms of self-help literature, you know, funded by the PHA. There's all the parenting programs, again, you know, funded. So there's lots of, you know, all the work that's going on in terms of early intervention, parent and support, you know, that Maurice is coordinating as well. So I think there's lots of things. There is something about actually how do we collectively bring it all together. So I think there's lots of things, Elena, that are work in progress, and we can really shine a light and you know, improve things, as Kevin says, and we're always looking at that, because essentially trauma-informed practice is hand in hand with quality improvement. You know, it's about how do we continue to improve things.
Thank you so much for that, Orla. So again, lots of great questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time to address all of them. The one final question I'll quickly address myself is a question asking, will there be a training that targets community and voluntary sector? So I'll actually give you guys an example of community and voluntary sector sort of focused training during my talk a little bit later on today. But of course, as Orla mentioned earlier, there is also the Safeguarding Board ACE Level 1 and 2 training, which excellent training. And you can also find the e-learning modules of those, e-learning versions rather, of those courses on the ASCERT website. So like I said, thank you guys all so much for those questions. And I apologize that we didn't have the time to get to all of them. They were all fantastic though. But I want to go ahead and introduce you to Deirdre McLaughlin. So she is with Connected for Life, and she's our keynote speaker today. And she will be discussing trauma-informed organizations with us. So away to you, Deirdre. Oh, you're unmuted and I can see you talking, but it's not quite coming through there.
Is that it now?
Yes.
Sorry, a wee button. Technology, eh? So if I could just suggest, this is a long morning and people are sitting in their homes. If I could ask people to take an opportunity just to get out of your chair or wherever you are, give yourself a wee stretch, maybe dander about the room, just take opportunities to kind of break and stretch while I'm sharing my screen here today. Okay. And hopefully everyone, I'm going to put it so that I can see. There we go. So can people see that okay? Yeah. Right. Okay. Here we go. So thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you for the first two speakers, Aidan and Orla, for stealing a lot of my content. So putting it into context, really, really interesting so far. I've really enjoyed it, and hopefully I can build on what's already been discussed. People have talked about SAMHSA. Some of the content I'll be talking about will be drawn on SAMHSA's work as well. So basically, what I'm going to be doing over the next hour, it's a very short time, it's just to give everybody a brief insight into what being a trauma-informed organisation means. So I'll be focusing on organisational change and what that journey might look like for your organisation, and help you reflect a bit on where you maybe are on this journey, where you hope to go, how you might get there. And it'll help you to think about why becoming a more trauma-informed and responsive organisation matters. Why would you bother? And how might it benefit the organisation, staff, and the people that you support? So first of all, let's think about what being a trauma-informed organisation actually means. because it means different things to different people. If we were in the room together, which unfortunately we're not, and we had a conversation about this, it would be interesting to hear people's definitions. Because the term trauma-informed is relatively new, particularly here in Northern Ireland, but it's fast become one of the most overused and sometimes misused terms around. So as well as talking about what it means this morning, I'm going to be focusing a wee bit on what it doesn't mean as well. So here we go with some of the information that's already been shared. So this is the 4 R's by SAMHSA, which I think Aidan and Orla both referred to. And SAMHSA says that in trauma-informed organisations, people at all levels of the organisation or system have a basic realisation about the widespread and often hidden experience of trauma, and they also realise how it can affect individuals, families, organisations and communities, including how it can impact development, behaviour and coping strategies. Trauma-informed and responsive organisations recognise. So in these organisations, people can recognise the signs and symptoms of trauma in their organisation itself, in staff, in those that use their services and in their communities and societies. And they recognise the impact of trauma on behaviour, on self-esteem, on the ability to trust and feel safe. And they recognise the coping strategies that people use. The principles of a trauma-informed approach are understood by everyone, and they're applied to all areas of the organisation, and that includes the culture of the organisation, the policies, the practices, the environments and more. And last but certainly not least, trauma-informed and responsive organisations resist re-traumatisation, because everyone in those organisations is aware that organisations and individuals can unintentionally cause stress or harm.
Deirdre, can I just, sorry, interrupt you a second? Yeah. The left-hand side of your screen isn't visible. There's a bar covering it. And a few of the participants are, that's it gone now. Great.
Gone now.
Thank
there
you.
We go. Is that better? I've just moved the video panel. Sorry. Thank you for highlighting that, Kevin. Oh, it's gone again. There we go. Better now? Yep. So where was he? Yes, everyone in organisations can, they know that organisations can cause harm. And I know personally in my work, I worked for many years as a manager in the Youth Justice Agency, and I know I've caused harm through my work, through lack of knowledge, through well-intentioned practice, through not knowing, through making mistakes, and everyone else is the same. So it's okay to say that, and it's okay just to rupture that repair. Yeah, I think I've kind of covered all that. So the next slide is just a simple explanation of trauma-informed approaches that we share with communities. Most of our work at the minute is in communities. And it just simply says that being trauma-informed and responsive approaches means understanding that stress, hurt and suffering can leave lasting wounds on people, on organisations and communities, and noticing how and when these wounds show up. It means acting on this knowledge in how we are and in what we do, creating safety, building hope and healing, and doing everything we can to ensure that we don't make things worse. So one of the most important aspects of being a trauma-informed organisation is recognising that trauma can affect everyone. And that includes staff, and that organisations themselves can experience and cause trauma. And I'm sure, again, if we were in the room and I was to ask everybody to name an organisation that they would describe as traumatised or trauma causing, they could do that. Some people here may have directly experienced organisational trauma themselves, maybe through being bullied or harassed in their workplace, maybe through being treated differently because of age, gender, religion, culture, disability, other characteristics, or for other reasons. So trauma can affect organisations, and it can become embedded into the culture, just in the same way as it affects individuals, families and communities. And that can be because maybe of an event, maybe a serious incident, or maybe a long-term experience like toxic or abusive leadership in an organisation. And traumatised organisations, like people, can spend their time in fight, flight, and freeze mode. That means they can be described as angry, aggressive, reactive, crisis-driven, chaotic, hostile, or authoritarian. Organizations can become fearful, reactive, critical, judgmental, dehumanizing, oppressive, blaming, or shaming. For example, maybe labeling people who fail to conform or attend as resistant or hard to engage. And organizations can feel stuck, avoidant, numb, hopeless, avoiding change and sticking to rigid rules and structures. And these organizations can cause further trauma to service users and staff. And the staff can become demoralized, and they tend to have high turnover of staff. When we're taking part in professional development, days like today, we're generally talking about trauma. We usually talk about it as if it's out there in the people that we support. We don't really talk about our own. And that's an important aspect of trauma-informed practice and being a trauma-informed organisation. It's important to acknowledge that people who choose to work in caring or helping professions are more likely to have experienced trauma and adversity than average. A recent study by Thomas in 2016, and I found this study in this book here. Some of you may know this book. It's a treasure box for creating trauma-informed organisations by Dr. Karen Treisman. And we're lucky to have some input into that book, but she shared a lot of research about this topic. And one of that pieces of research was by Thomas in 2016. And I'm a social worker and find this one interesting. Thomas found that 42% of social workers had 4 or more ACEs. And that's compared to the original ACEs study, ACEs being adverse childhood experiences, which found that 12% of that original population. So that study found that almost 3 times prevalence within social work populations. So maybe when we're talking about the statistics from ACEs, we should change how we do that. And as well as sharing population risk for things like heart disease, violence, and addictions, we should add in, if you 4 or more ACEs, you're X times more likely to become a social worker or work in another caring or helping profession, just to be a bit more balanced about potential outcomes and actually to reflect on the importance of post-traumatic healing, growth and resilience, and think about how adversity and stress can drive people to support others. Because there should be no shame in owning our own stuff, because that stuff is what makes us who we are. And it's part of our journey to being here today, all of us. Trauma-informed organisations know this, and they realise that who we are on our journey to getting here, be that journey blissful or challenging, is one of the greatest gifts that we bring to our work and the people that we support. But trauma-informed organisations also realise that working with the trauma of others can rub up against our own wounds. And that's why trauma-informed organisations ensure that their staff are supported well in the work that they do through good supervision, through team support and self-care. So what does it look like when the trauma of others rubs up against our wounds? Well, maybe it could look like the social worker whose mother had an alcohol addiction as a child, and now that social worker has a reputation for arguing for children to be removed as soon as there's any evidence of addiction in the home. Or maybe the teacher who has undiagnosed dyslexia and got a really hard time in school, picking on children when she gets that email from the Senko to say that the child's going through a hard time and needs a bit of support. Or maybe the person who works in the benefits office grew up living in extreme poverty and they roll their eyes in tut every time they're filling in hardship claims forms because they think people are getting it too easy these days. So the bottom line is, if an organisation doesn't support their staff adequately by holding space for supervision, space for team support, and supporting their self-care, that can lead to poor and even dangerous practice. And it can also increase the risk of secondary and vicarious trauma, which is the emotional impact of daily repeated exposure to harm. So the next slide is a definition by Dr. Treisman that I mentioned earlier on. And she says that being trauma-informed is much more than just a simple word or term. It's multi-layered and a whole system approach. It should apply to every sphere of an organisation and be fully embedded into the different levels of a system. This includes integrating trauma-related aspects, knowledge and concept into things such as training, recruitment, induction, policies, procedures, mission statements, language used, having experts of experience, the environment, team meetings, supervision, reflective practice, leadership, and so much more. Whew. In other words, it's not simple. It's very complex. If there's one thing that you take out of today, it is that we're all starting somewhere. We're all on the journey, as Orla said, but it's not simple. It is not a one-off training event. And as Karen describes in her book, it's not a fruit bowl being placed in a reception area. It's not changing one policy. It's not a tick box exercise, although there are certainly really good ways to start. The journey to becoming trauma-informed and responsive is a long-term one. It's one that requires awareness, commitment, change and reflection, not just on an individual level, but at a whole organisation and system level across many aspects, practice, policy and environment. But it does pay off. I mean, we do, one of the things that we do is training, 2-day training called an Introduction to Trauma-Informed Organisations, specifically looking at organisational change. And the word introduction's in there, and people often say 2 days, really, introduction. But by the end of the 2 days, they realise why, because there's a lot of areas that we've just scratched the surface of. And after we deliver that 2 days training, we mentor intensively 2 organisations each year on their journey to becoming more trauma-informed and responsive. And we support the leadership team, we support staff, maybe through reflective practice, maybe through helping them focus on things like language, or maybe if they're looking at their physical environment. And even after that year of intensive mentoring, people tell us, actually, we just realise how little we know. The more you know, the less you realise you know, if that makes sense. Probably not. So the next slide is the 6 key principles, which are the overall goals that should inform a trauma-informed approach. And Orla's already shared these, so I'm not going to go into these in any detail. But trauma makes people feel powerless, unsafe, and it affects their worth. So these goals and principles are really about restoring those 3 things: restoring safety, restoring power, and restoring self-worth. So the first one is safety. Safety is the cornerstone to trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed approaches, trauma-informed organisations, trauma-informed systems, creating a safe environment for everyone at all levels, so physical, emotional, relational, cultural, moral, spiritual, psychological, etc. Safety for staff, service users, for others. And trustworthiness and transparency are key to creating that emotional safety. Empowerment, voice and choice, providing the structure, the support for people to have their voices heard meaningfully and make decisions for themselves, about themselves. The peer support has already been mentioned. Collaboration and mutuality has already been mentioned, again, being meaningful sharing of power and decision making. And cultural, historical and gender issues, which is where when an organisation moves past cultural and gender stereotypes and biases and really recognises and reflects on historical trauma and thinks about the barriers that people face in being treated with equity and compassion. And that means being able to recognise our own and our organisational prejudices, biases, and being able to openly share these, because that's challenging. So our work each year involves mentoring 2 organisations, as I mentioned, to be more trauma-informed and responsive. And these organisations spend the year focusing on putting the principles that we just shared and that Orla shared earlier into practice by focusing on 6 key things: their values, leadership and culture, what they do, their practice, how they create safety, policies and procedures, and how they support their staff wellbeing. So I'm just going to go into a bit more detail on each of those, although I'll not have time to get into too much detail. And I'm going to try and share maybe an example for each of these areas. So values, what are values? Values are really what matters to an organisation, what beliefs guide the organisation's purpose and direction. Organisations that are trauma-informed have a strong shared identity, beliefs and purpose. If you ask anybody in that organisation, if you ask the CEO, staff, people who use the services, or even if you ask the person who's contracted to come in once a week to clean the offices, if you ask them about that organisation, they'll all say different things, but what they say will reflect the organisational values, what matters to that organisation, what they're about. But it's important that these values are written down somewhere. Might not be written down, they might be shared through online, they might be shared through videos, they might be shared in other ways, but it's important that they're collated and that it's meaningful and that everyone, management, staff, people with lived experience of those services have input into what those values are, and that they should reflect the values of a trauma-informed approach. So emotional and physical safety for all, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration and empowerment. And an example, just trying to think of an example of how people have made changes in this area. An organisation that we worked with looked at their values. They had a value statement and it had been written with input from everyone involved, but their reflection was it's written. Most of the people that use our services, many of the people that use our services don't have English as a first language. Many of the people that use our services have literacy issues. It's not meaningful for them. So what they did was they created, the people that used their services created pieces of artwork that represented what they were about, that represented their values, and they shared that artwork in their entrance hall so that if you walked in, you knew what they were about just by seeing the art represented. What about leadership and culture? So culture is really the accepted beliefs, values, and ways of interacting within an organisation. Leadership's basically how leaders and managers behave and lead. So when you think about organisational culture, organisations, like people, have personality, feelings, belief, and an energy. A negative organisational culture can lead to negative energy and an atmosphere. I mean, I'm sure you have all gone into another organisation at times and went, I kind of feel there's something off here. What's going on here? And that kind of can reflect that culture. Organisations that are trauma-informed have a culture of openness and they're willing to be vulnerable. Not a culture of silence and avoidance. They're able to talk about things openly and they're able to say, we messed up. And that's usually modelled by leaders and it permeates through the organisation into policies and how things are done. Trauma-informed organisations have a reflective rather than reactive culture and they're able to deal with conflict in healthy ways. They're able to see mistakes as learning opportunities. And maybe that's the difference between openly encouraging feedback, including critical feedback, rather than saying, we have a target of having no complaints this year. And it's about giving people space to reflect, to express, to be creative, because that leads to innovation. Trauma-informed organisations have a culture of compassion, empathy, respect, curiosity, vulnerability. And trauma-informed leaders walk the talk. They don't send their staff off to a training event on trauma-informed practice or approaches or organisations. They go themselves. They lead. They embody trauma-informed values and principles themselves. They're reflective and relational, but they're not afraid to challenge or make tough decisions. They're collaborative and innovative. They're motivating and hopeful, because hope's a huge part of trauma-informed approaches. And they're open to constructive criticism. And they lead the way in organisational change. And again, thinking of a practical example of change that has been made in this area, because as Orla said, small change can have a big impact. One leader in an organisation, a very charismatic and highly respected leader, was struggling to ensure that staff engaged in self-care. So this leader was telling staff, take your holidays. When things are tough, take time off, but people were working round the clock. And this leader was quite concerned until they reflected on what they were modelling as a leader. They themselves worked round the clock. They didn't take their holidays. They took calls on the weekend. And they realised that because people respected them, maybe not intentionally, they were modelling their behaviour. So that leader then thought, I need to do this for myself. So they started taking their own holidays. They started having more boundaries in relation to their work-life balance. And then that had an impact on staff as well. So what about practice? What I use the term practice, the work that people do. Trauma-informed organisations support practice that help people heal from trauma, and practice that doesn't further harm. Because as I said earlier, we can all cause harm inadvertently and well-intentionally. Is that a thing? Trauma-informed practice focuses on what works, uses evidence-based, trauma-specific interventions that meet the needs of that particular intervention at that particular time. Not off-the-shelf programs, unless they're appropriate for that individual at that time. And it's about having an understanding of trauma theory. So knowing that talking therapies alone are unlikely to support healing, and incorporating more body-based approaches and interventions. Trauma-informed practice is strengths-based, relationship-based, healing and hopes-based. And practitioners are strengths-based, relationship-based, and encouraged to engage in reflective practice and have self-awareness. Understand their own triggers, understand how their own wounds show up, as I mentioned earlier, and engage in good self-care. What can be a challenge in this area is when people are overstretched, under-resourced, have high caseloads, and are not able to engage in supervision. And again, thinking about a practical example here, thinking about a youth service who was working with a group of young people who were quite dysregulated. And they introduced a time at the start of each group where they shared a regulating or grounding activity. So things like maybe breathing, tapping, and they tried different techniques. And they asked the young people to think about what worked for them and to find a tool that helped them to be present for the rest of the session. And then they modelled throughout that group, they might have done, so say there was a conversation that was getting really heavy and people were starting to feel flat, they would do something to upregulate. They would get up and get people moving and maybe put a bit of music or clapping or do something upregulating. And when people were overstimulated, they did some downregulating activity. They might have changed the lighting. They might have done something kind of more focused on more breathing again. So what about safety? Mentioned, and it's been mentioned already throughout the morning, safety is key. Focusing on trauma-informed organisational change is about creating environments that reduce fear, stress and dysregulation, and they increase safety and trust. It's about creating safety at all levels, as I mentioned earlier. And it might be physical safety, for example. So trauma-informed organisation think about their physical spaces in terms of how people are going to experience that through a trauma-informed lens. They pay attention to things like lighting, sounds, smells, seating, potential triggers, use of artwork, signage that respects cultural diversity. They try to ensure, as far as possible, we can only do what we can do, that their spaces aren't institutionalised. And they ask people that are using their services to tell them what feels right for them when they're designing and updating their physical spaces. And there's also a focus on making sure that people feel emotionally safe, supporting their regulation and helping everyone stay grounded. And staff will be aware of what some signs of dysregulation might be. So what it might look like when an individual is triggered. And again, that's very unique and they can act on that appropriately. Trauma-informed organisations are aware of the huge importance of language and how this can be oppressive and make people feel unsafe. Staff feel safe in trauma-informed organisations. And that is about communication and transparency, because lack of communication is often one of the most common issues that comes up, for example, in serious case reviews and staff surveys. So there are clear expectations, clear roles, clear boundaries. There are policies to support safety, like good lone working policies. And what can be a challenge to staff feeling safe in organisations is excessive change and, I suppose, financial instability. So things like short-term contracts. We're working with organisations at the moment that are doing amazing work in their communities, but have had their funding cut, and in some stages, in some areas, actually their funding lost. So thinking about changes that people have made in practice in this area. So an organisation designing a shared space for young people. So that organisation wasn't only thinking about how it's going to look good, if it's going to be fit for purpose. They're also thinking about trauma theory in terms of how they're going to design their space. Could it be too overstimulating? What about those fluorescent lights? Are they a good idea? Should we have lamps? Would it be thinking about cultural lens? What would it feel like? What would this space feel like for someone who doesn't speak English? What about someone that has a physical disability? Is there wheelchair access? What about hidden disabilities? What about someone that's come into this space that has been in a children's home? What would it feel like for them? And they ask the young people themselves, say, what would this feel like for your peers? So moving on to policies and procedures. And they're really the outworkings of the organisation's values and purpose. And therefore they have to be written in a way that reflects this. And they shouldn't be just paper exercises, not that folder that sits in the cupboard, or the folder, I don't know about yourselves, but you know the folder that you're given when you start working in an organisation and you spend all day reading it. By the end of the day, you've no idea what's in it. Policies and procedures are really important. They should be purposeful, live documents, and they should be accessible. And whether that means they should be online rather than on paper, whatever way works for your specific organisation. And they should be a collaboration between management, staff, and the people who use the services. Very often our policies are handed to us from another part of the service. And this also applies to assessment and evaluation. Assessment should be strengths-based. It shouldn't come from a deficit approach, and we should consider language used in our assessments. And we should ensure that we have input from service users, and that also applies to our records as well. We should be writing our records in a way that we would be comfortable with people reading. And in fact, we should be ensuring that people have access to that. And thinking about examples that changes that people have made in this area. I'm thinking about a nursery in our area, and people might be aware of this nursery. When I talk about it, I'll not say their name, but you might recognize it. This nursery knew that why people came to their nursery is because they loved the children that they looked after. If a child fell, they cuddled them, and they told parents that, but they told parents that quietly until they decided to shout from the rooftops. They changed their policies. They wrote in their policies and their documents that they shared, "We will love your children. We will hug your children." That was brave, but it was authentic. And finally, I'm talking very fast because I want to get through all this. Staff wellbeing is really how the organisation supports and looks after their staff. In trauma-informed organisations, staff have access to good quality, regular supervision and reflective practice, depending on what the organisation does and what that looks like. It will be different. But supervision is not just line management supervision. It is about helping people reflect on themselves. It's about being able to pick up and sensitively address secondary and vicarious trauma. And good supervision leaves staff feeling valued, empowered, and energised. In trauma-informed organisations, people don't go, "Oh my goodness, there's a team meeting today." They go, "There's a team meeting today," because team meetings are meaningful. trauma-informed organisations genuinely focus on the training and development of their staff and their staff's work-life balance. And in trauma-informed organisations, self-care is recognised as one of the most important buffers to secondary and vicarious trauma. It's hugely important within the organisation's culture, and it's viewed as a necessity, not a luxury. And thinking about changes that people have made in this respect, I'm thinking about an organisation that was working with young people at risk, and young people that often were displaying quite distressing behaviours. And the staff were saying at the end of the shift they were feeling really distressed. They were going home still feeling distressed and experiencing probably secondary trauma. So that organisation decided to, we need to think about scheduling time, paid time within our shift for debriefing at the end of the shift. And staff said that really, really made a difference and helped them to go home without carrying their experiences with them. Now, this is very, very brief brush into these areas, and I'm sure you can think of some examples yourself as we're going through this. So I'm going to now look at the trauma-informed journey. What does the journey to becoming trauma-informed look like for an organisation? Now, we've got a wee road there. Orla also shared the road to being trauma-informed earlier on. And I think what I'm going to say here is language is important. And Orla also mentioned this. There is a lot of language in this area. And sometimes people use different language. I will admit, when I first started looking at this, I became overwhelmed. I got confused about terms like trauma-informed, trauma-responsive, trauma-aware, trauma-sensitive, trauma-specific. And even looking at the road, people put different terms at different stages in the road, and that's okay. It's less about the language and more about the action. But I think, and that's one of the reasons we did this road, because most of the training that we do is in communities, so we try to share this information in a way that makes sense to people. And our understanding of this, and it's just our understanding of this, it's not necessarily the same as other people's, but the trauma-informed journey is a lifelong journey. It's a journey that lasts the life of the organisation. And it's a journey from being trauma sensitive and starting to think about trauma and how it affects your organisation, your staff and those you support, to becoming trauma aware and learning as much as you can, maybe through training events like today, maybe through reading or team discussions, to being trauma informed, where you know what you want to do as an organisation and you're working really hard to put the culture and practices into place. When you're trauma responsive, the ethos and practice around trauma are part of who you are. They're so embedded in the organisational policy, practice and culture that you couldn't possibly write a policy that isn't trauma informed. You couldn't possibly open a new building without thinking about trauma theory when you're doing that. And this is a bit, for me, it reminds me of the journey from thinking about learning to drive to being a competent driver. And that's very interesting because I did my driving test 7 times, at least. It just shows the length of the journey can be. So the first step in learning to drive is the thinking part, isn't it? And that's when we get our provisional license. And that's a bit like when we start to think about trauma, how it impacts your practice and what you might do. And then the next part is the learning part. You get your L plates up, you go out and you do your driving lessons, and you're actually developing your awareness and skills about how to drive. A bit like when you're developing your knowledge and skills and learning about trauma. Then there's the knowing part. That day when you get your pass, you pass your test, you have your R plates up, and you've got official confirmation that you're now fully informed and you're fit to drive. Now you can drive, but you still have to consciously think about everything you do. You get into the car, mirror, signal, maneuver. And again, that's a bit like when you know exactly what you want and what you need to do to become more trauma informed, and you're consciously thinking about it, working hard to implement it in every area of your practice. And then the final part is the being part. That's the stage when you're a confident and competent driver. Something you can do without having to think about it. You get to work in the morning and you can't remember how you got there. And again, that's a bit like when the principles, the ethos, and the practice around trauma are so fully embedded into your organisation, practice, and culture. It's just part of who you are and what you do. Now, this is not like the journey to driving to work in the morning. You might be thinking as you're sitting there, actually, in terms of, in my organisation, the practice that we say you work with young people and families, our practice with young people and families very much is embedded in trauma theory. We have really good supervision and we're getting really good feedback and we're creating effective change with young people. But actually, our policies and procedures don't really fit with what we do. Maybe policies and procedures, maybe you have policies that say our organisation values staff as our greatest asset. But if a staff member's off long-term sick because they're terminally ill, they get an official warning because they meet trigger points. Maybe your physical environment, maybe you've inherited a building that's really institutionalized and you're trying really hard to make it warm, but it still doesn't really fit. So you might be further along in this journey in some aspects of your work than others. You might have focused a lot on language, signage, inclusion, anti-oppressive practice. Or perhaps, maybe as an organisation, we talked about how organisations can be traumatised. Maybe you were an organisation that was very far in the journey and then you had a traumatic event, maybe a serious incident. Maybe you had a leader that was driving the organisation forward who left and you have a new leader who's very different. So this is very complex and very nuanced. Okay, so I keep talking about how complex this is. So because of that, why would you bother? Why are people taking the morning out of their busy diaries today to be here? Why have so many people engaged in the training that the Safeguarding Board offers, for example? Why are people doing this? Because the payoffs are huge. The payoffs for organisations, the payoffs for the people that we support, and the payoffs for us as staff. And I'm just going to briefly look at some of the benefits of becoming more trauma informed as an organisation. First of all, if you work in a trauma informed organisation, that organisation has a shared identity, purpose and vision. And this promotes organisational wellness. Organisations, like individuals, can be healthy or unhealthy. And if you have a healthy organisation, well-being leads to well-doing. You're going to have better outcomes. And that quote comes from, you'll have heard Dr. Treisman quoting this, and it's from Wellness Project Kenya. Organisations that are trauma-informed have good morale. They have better outcomes. People stay there. It improves their reputation. And because of that, if you're a voluntary or community organisation and you need to apply for funding, it can help you get funding. And it supports collaboration and innovation. What are the benefits for staff? Well, you're not embarrassed to say, I work in such and such. You're proud to say that you work there. And the values of the organisation very much fit with your own values, and that feels good. And you feel valued too as a worker. You're happier, healthier, more regulated. You're less stressed and you've better relationships both in work and outside work, because we know how our work life impacts our home life and vice versa. You're supported by supervision and a good team, and you're supported to engage in your self-care, and all of that can help prevent burnout and secondary and vicarious trauma. What about the people that we support? Well, because trauma-informed organisations are relationship-based. People feel respected and valued. They don't feel shamed and blamed. And it feels safe physically and emotionally and at all levels. And because trauma-informed approaches are strength-based, they support healing and they help to build resilience and growth, hope, recovery. And service users feel done with, not to. They don't feel oppressed or judged, and they feel respected and that their views matter. And they know that people care about their own individual experience of trauma, their historical trauma, their cultural trauma, their personal trauma, their developmental and relational trauma, and that community trauma matters, and that people will take that into consideration and will understand how that might impact their behaviour. This quote from Alexander Den Hedger sums it up. When a flower doesn't bloom, you fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower. Because trauma-informed organisations create the environment that helps those they support to heal, bloom and thrive. They don't shame or blame, but they understand the impact of trauma, they support healing and they build hope. So now I'm going to show a video. It's about 10 minutes, so hopefully I'll get that done before we finish. And the video is by Jazz Ampa-Farr. It's a TED Talk. She was a keynote speaker at a conference we ran a few years ago with Bernardo's Women's Aid and Stranmillis College. And in this video, Jazz shares her own personal and really emotive story. She tells us about how being treated with compassion, authenticity, acceptance and humanness by teachers who focused on her strengths and held high hope and expectations for her, how that helped her to overcome shame, build resilience and to thrive and to bloom, I suppose. I mean, this is trauma-informed and responsive practice in action, even if the teachers that she talks about have never heard of the terms. Now, just a little caveat, Jazz in this video does share some really painful experiences, including details of her own experiences of abuse and her brother's addiction. So make a decision for yourself whether or not it's the right time for you to watch this and listen to this, and if you need to step away, that's okay as well.
I'm alive today because of heroes like you. And if you're sitting there thinking, I'm not a hero, that makes sense because
Nope, that freeze.
Yeah, it looks like it might be paused.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
All right. Fingers crossed.
I'm alive today because of heroes like you. And if you're sitting there thinking, I'm not a hero, that makes sense because
Okay. I'm going to try and share it through the link. So I'm going to, sorry, I would like to share this because I'm going to stop share and I'm going to share maybe this will work. Okay. Sorry about this, everybody. The joys of technology.
I'm alive
Heard okay?
today because of heroes like you. And if you're sitting there thinking, I'm not a hero, that makes sense because, you know, the way you describe yourself, I'm just a mum, I'm just a teacher, like we haven't got any capacity to change the world. And not only that, life's hard and you get challenges thrown at you every day. And some days, I don't know about you, but I feel like I can barely sort myself out, let alone anyone else. So it kind of makes sense just to keep your head down. But if I'm right, and you are a hero, then keeping your head down comes at a huge cost, and it has huge consequences. On the flip side, if you were just like 10% braver, then you could transform a life. So what does being a bit braver look like? Well, a few years ago, I was watching The Apprentice on TV, and what I should have been doing was writing some next steps for a school I was helping with spelling, but I got sucked into watching the candidates stuff up, making like simple tasks, but getting it totally wrong. And I started thinking, you know, if I went on The Apprentice, I would win. And then I could start a business and no child would ever leave school without the ability to read, write and spell ever again. And that is a fantastic plan. So that's exactly what I did.
Sometimes it can be very difficult to put your finger on that moment when a candidate puts themselves in the firing. But no, for you it was right here.
So here's a curveball I'm going to send you right now. Ladies, who's going to be the project manager on this task?
I am. I had my hand up before I'd realised I'd volunteered.
Very brave indeed.
So as you can see, I was brave, and it made no difference because I was fired at the end of the first week. But it kind of makes me a bit of an expert on failure. I might do today, but today I want to tell you the true story behind The Apprentice. And it's the story of what happens when people just like you stand when a hero is needed. And growing up, I was one little girl that needed a hero. It took one woman and a handful of guys to create this family. You can all tell which one I am, yeah? They're like the good-looking one. And this is the only photo I have of all of us together because when I was 8 years old, we were separated and put into care. By 8 years old, I'd been punched in the face. By 8 years old, I'd been forced to steal so I could eat. And by 8 years old, I'd been raped countless times. If it feels like I'm telling your story, I want you to know it's okay. You're safe with what I'm about to say because you know, and I know, that the real journey is repairing the damage to our sense of self. But I want to share this with you because I want to show you what's possible. And I mean what's possible from the point of view of a broken little girl who believes that she is completely worthless. Because this little girl went to school. And school meant everything to me. Everything. School is where I laughed. Specifically, I laughed at a teacher called Mr. Williams. Mr. Williams was under the impression that he was in charge of our class, which made it very difficult for us to get on. And he used to have this moustache, and he used to shout, and his moustache would dance. I'm absolutely furious! Now, like others, Mr. Williams asked me about my bruises, and I did what I always did and lied. But he leant into me, and he said, I think you're protecting someone. And what you need to know is that I'm here to protect you. I'm here to look out for you. I will never forget his face when I told him just a little bit of the truth, pained. Like my words were causing him actual pain, and he didn't say anything, but he took me to the library, and I peeked through the window and I could see him outside. He was standing there with a cricket bat in one hand, and he was slapping it like this into the other. Now, I don't have any idea what he thought he was going to do with that bat, but he stood there until a social worker came. And it wasn't the rescue that had the impact on me. It wasn't the fact that in that library was the first time in my life I'd ever felt safe. It was the fact that he showed he cared, that he stood for me. Growing up in care and on the street is pretty hideous. But I was incredibly lucky. I had 4 more ordinary heroes show up in my life. And each one of them, and they all happened to be teachers, showed they cared by holding a vision of success for me. Mr. Williams stood outside a library. Mrs. Cook held my hand when she knew the fire alarm was going to go off. Mr. Simpson asked me how I was every single day and then waited for an answer. Miss Archer valued all of my ideas, even though a lot of them were borderline bonkers. And Mr. Redman, well, he just waited for me to try. And then he stood there and smiled the biggest, proudest smile. I mean, these seem like small things, but these 5 adults enabled a broken little girl to become me. They did more than that, actually. You know, because of them, because they believed in me, because they knew that they were human first and teacher second, it changed everything. You know, on my own, all I could see was darkness in my future. I had this recurring image in my head that I'd be dead by the time I was 40. But you know, those 5 adults had faith in me, and I wasn't going to give up on myself. So because of them, I blagged my way into university. My grades weren't great, but I finished school and I got there and I trained to be a teacher just like them. But even more, they gave me the opportunity to start considering something that I never dared dream was possible. Because they built a relationship with me, I started thinking I could do that with someone else. And what they gave me is incredible. They made it possible for me to believe I could and go on to have a family of my own. So, you know, this is success. This is it. Because I broke the cycle and I'm living the dream. My husband adores me. He's at the back, you can ask him. My kids are the most amazing human people on the planet. They are. And I just, you know, this is me thriving, isn't it? It's except for I'm thriving, me, but I wasn't the only child in that photo. I suppose, you know, this really, it's about my brother. Because the real story behind The Apprentice is that in the middle of the week when that show aired, can you imagine all your friends and family finding out you're on that? My phone's blowing up with OMG texts the whole time. And I'm doing TV interviews and I'm having this glitzy, wonderful time of being a Z-list reality TV star. And in the middle of that, I had to go and identify my baby brother's body. Because he took a heroin overdose and died 4 weeks before his 40th birthday. After that, after, like, you know, the initial grief, I'm standing at the sink one day and I'm washing up and I feel like this welling come up inside me, and I turn to my husband and say, I have to stop. I can't do this. This life, it's not enough. It's not enough. What's the point in me winning when everyone else is losing? There's kids out there now that need a hero, and I have to do something because I couldn't save Paul, so I have to make it right. And stories without any heroes in it, they don't have happy endings. I wish that I could tell you that being a hero is easy. I wish I could say it didn't cost anything. But I punched and kicked Mr. Williams because he like dared to care about me, and I just could not accept that I was worthy of that. But he didn't wait for me to get it. He didn't need me to understand. He just stood. Because that's what heroes do. And that's why I decided to do this. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm standing here. Because change won't happen until your desire to make a difference is bigger and stronger and more powerful than your fear of trying. So please, stop doubting that you're a hero. And stop worrying that you haven't got what it takes. You are good enough. Every day I work with teachers who they're crushed by our education system and they think that they're just ordinary and not brilliant. And it, you know, it breaks my heart because that those heroes make a difference. And if you if you know that in your schools and in your workplaces, your friends, your family, this is their story. It's not just my story. The details might be different, but the struggle is the same. It's anyone's story who is afraid they might just be unlovable, and in their story, you're the hero. The hero is you. So go be a hero. And it doesn't matter if you don't feel ready, and it is totally okay if you're scared, but do it anyway. Because when you do, you can literally transform a life. Thank you. Oh my God!
Okay. I'm not going to go back to the PowerPoint, but I think you would all agree that this quote, I'm just going to share a final quote before I finish, from Maya Angelou, sums up Jazz's experience, and most of you will know this quote. Quote is, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel." And the journey to becoming more trauma-informed and responsive as an organisation is about many things, starting, as Jazz said there, by being human first. It's about humanising our organisations, our processes, our systems and practices, so that people feel safe, people feel seen and valued, and creating an environment that supports hope, healing and resilience. That's me 1 minute over.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. That was fantastic. I had to look away towards the end of that video. I'm a contagious crier, you know, so seeing her get very emotional, but it was nice. But it was a lovely video and a fantastic talk. Like I said, really, I learned, you know, a lot about trauma-informed organizations. So thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to open it up to questions for the next 9 minutes or so. So we have a couple here already. We take a look here. So there's, can you lead me? So one person asked, can you lead me to training on implementing our practice into policy? So of course, you kind of mentioned you do your mentoring work and you do your trauma-informed organization work. So would that have a lot of focus on implementing practice into policy, or vice versa, I suppose?
Yeah, that would be, I mean, Orla maybe can come in on this to see if there's a safeguarding board of anything, but that would be part of our mentoring, would be looking at various aspects, and it depends on where the organisation. I suppose at the start we have a form that people complete to look at all the areas and where they would maybe need to focus on, because there's only so much you can do in a year. And some organisations will say, listen, we need to really look at our policies. So that's one area that we can look at in terms of the mentoring, absolutely. Or did you want to come in on that?
I suppose what I would say, Deirdre, is one of the things that we're looking at is what I mentioned, this online organisational toolkit. And I suppose what Deirdre has referred to there so comprehensively is looking at the multifaceted aspect of this. And, you know, it's not a one-off training. So our focus has been actually developing an online toolkit, and that actually will be universally available, and it will follow the 10 SAMHSA domains. So we are going to look at, you know, is there an organizational commitment? You know, how can we amplify this within an organization? How can we collectively identify all our trauma champions? Some organizations might start top down, some will start bottom up, some will have an implementation team at that middle management level. So what were you doing is, so in terms of, I'm not saying there's a specific training. What we're saying is we're hoping that the toolkit will actually be something that will support organizations on that journey. However, you know, certainly in terms of our role of supporting organizations on that implementation, you know, anyone can get in touch with myself or Sheena Rigg in terms of sort of a conversation in terms of really starting to think about, because some organizations, as we said, are at different starting points. You know, those organizations that the SBNI is on this journey as well. Some of those organizations who are sitting on the TIP committee, and we have representatives from SPPG, from PHA, community and voluntary sector, you know, police, probation, youth justice agency, they're all at different stages on that journey. So sometimes the bit that I think we can all support is connecting the system to itself. Does your organization have trainers, because, you know, some people don't know that there are trainers, you know, within their own organizations, because a lot of these organizations, they're different scales. Some of the organizations are very big. So it's a huge piece in terms of connecting the system to itself, because we can have, you know, lots of examples of really good trauma-informed practice, but sometimes it's not joined up, particularly the challenge within some of those larger organizations as well. So in terms of, you know, there are some resources in terms of those journeys of organizations. You know, I would encourage anyone to read that Salvation Army report in terms of their experience of actually using the SAMHSA domains, the SAMHSA principles, you know, looking at entry to exit, looking at those quality improvement approaches. So sometimes it's actually those case examples that can support organizations, because every organization is very varied, has different starting points, but that message of connecting the system to itself. And again, we're hoping that both the evidence review, some of the work we're doing on comms, and this organizational toolkit at the moment, those types of things are going to be helpful for organizations in implementing that. We're also offering a trial at the moment. I know Trauma Informed Oregon have a new tool coming out as well in terms of looking at supporting organizations in terms of this implementation. And we had a recent conversation with Mandy Davis on that. And so again, I think I'm hoping that some of what you know, we're looking at in terms of our current work plan will actually support organizations in that journey.
Thank you both so much for that.
Thanks, Orla.
Speaking of Trauma-Informed Oregon, because I believe they actually do have tools for this, but again, I'll present this question to you, Deirdre. So are there quality assurance or monitoring tools to help us check how well we are doing as a trauma-informed organization?
Well, I suppose I can only speak for ourselves. I mean, just to maybe explain to people, what the work that we're doing is specifically in the Lisburn area. It's really about developing a more trauma-informed community. And it's alongside the Resurgam Trust and Early Intervention Lisburn, which is a project run by Bernardo's and Resurgam. And we're kind of looking at the community around there, and we're working with organisations within that community. So we have developed a tool for the organisations, but it's specifically in relation to our mentoring, looking at those areas, and that can help. And if anyone wants to have a copy of that, they can. But we've done it specifically for those organisations. They would ask their staff to fill the form in at the start of the year, and then ask them to look at fill it in again at the end of the year to see if there's been any development, which can help inform their focus really in terms of the mentoring going forward. And again, there might be something that we're looking at that from a more strategic point of view.
Yeah. I suppose it's just to say, in terms of that actual assessment tool, what we mentioned there from Trauma Informed Oregon, what they have going alongside that, now there's a cost for it, is that Portland University are actually going to be doing the audit and the research piece of that. So you can ask your staff to complete a tool, and they have 5 areas: organizational commitment, culture and climate, training, education, you know, policy, procedure, practice review, and then that piece on feedback and quality assurance. So each of those 5 headings, they then have subsections on lots of different questionnaires. So do you have a welcoming first point of contact? You know, your policies and procedures, are they reflective of diversity, equity, inclusion? And this is then scored independently with recommendations and a report. So this is actually kind of in process. It's going to be published soon. That's what we're offering, you know, supporting a trial off at the minute, because we're really keen to hear, might this be a tool that will really support organizations, give them recommendations, give them a baseline as to where they're at, let them have a sequential plan as to where they hope to focus next, and then, you know, recommendations and reports as how to support organizations on that journey. But I think, Deirdre, what you're saying is that coaching, supporting, mentoring, really supporting that organization is so important, because essentially trauma-informed practice is not just a tool, you know, it is relational. How do we convince, you know, the people that do the change, or the people who do the work? So I think it's that relational, you know, and how do we get alongside people and really convince them to the benefits of trauma-informed practice, and how they can play a part, how we can all play a part, and how do we really look at embedding this across the system.
Thank you both so much for that. Just one final question here, because we are about to run into our break time here at 11:10. So just one final question here. On the road to becoming a fully trauma-informed organization, do we need to create a bit of disruption or quote unquote good trauma? How do we know we are on the right road if there are divergent views?
Oh, on the road. I'm not quite sure if I understand the question. Do we need to create a bit of disruption or good trauma? I don't know what that means. Stress.
Yeah, it's stress. I'm kind of,
Yeah.
you might, and thank you just for this question, and hopefully I'm interpreting it correctly.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of getting the vibe that they're saying, sometimes when you're trying to put these things in place, you might have some people who are a bit stuck in the mud, or that sort of thing.
Yeah. I suppose what this person maybe is saying is, we had a conversation with an organization we're mentoring recently who challenged us on the word safety. Fair enough, because what they were saying is, for some people, safety, for individuals that are experiencing trauma, safety can be staying stuck in patterns that have served you, and that can feel safe. So for example, it might feel safe. I worked in the Youth Justice Agency for many years, and a lot of the young people that we work with would have felt safe in relationships that were very chaotic and potentially abusive, because that felt like that was an experience that they were used to, so it felt safe, and it's kind of counterintuitive. So for organizations, safety can be unhelpful. So sometimes you have to push people out of patterns, what they know is safety, into something a bit different. I'm going off on a tangent, but absolutely, it has to create effective change. We have to have uncomfortable conversations. We have to create a bit of stress within the system, because without stress, there's no change. Resilience can't happen without stress. Hope I've answered that question properly, or in some way anyway. Just aware of you're probably wanting to stop for a break now, Elena.
No, totally. That makes sense to me, and hopefully makes sense to the individual who asked that particular question. But as I was saying there, we are going to go ahead and take a little bit of a break here. So you guys will get a break before listening to my bit here. So we are going to take 10 minutes, and then when we come back, you guys will get to hear a little bit from me. Thank you so much. All right, so that is us back. So just a reminder to our panelists, if you have a look at the Q&A, of course, there are questions that come in maybe after we're done with our Q&A sections, or questions that sort of pop up afterwards. If there's a question that you think you can answer, you can either use the type answer function or send your answer to me, and I can do it in the type answer function for you. So now it's my turn. So what I'm going to do is I will pull my presentation here, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about a bit of work that I've done around the MACE, what's called the MACE Toolkit and Handbook. So just give me one moment here. Gotta shift some stuff around. Okie dokes. Can you guys see that okay? My panelists showed up. All right, fantastic. So what I'm here to talk to you guys about today, at least just a brief 30 minutes, so we're going to feel like we're flying through it. But I am going to introduce you guys to the MACE Trauma-Informed Practitioners Toolkit and Handbook, which is an example of some real life sort of practice that we have done with practitioners in the border county area. So I'll tell you a little bit about this here today. So first of all, I will say, like I said, I didn't really introduce myself too much in the beginning there, but my name is Elena Brewer, and I'm the training officer with ASCERT. I'm a master's qualified public health educator who's been practicing for over 10 years now, delivering training to young people and adults in the United States and Northern Ireland. ASCERT is a substance misuse and suicide prevention focused charity headquartered in Lisburn, in case you aren't familiar with us. So I'll give you a little bit of brief background there. So what I'm going to talk to you, like I said, about this very quick 30 minutes is we'll take a look at why did we even make this piece of work in the first place? So I'll tell you guys a little bit about what we know when it comes to things like ACE prevalence in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, because this is a cross-border project. So off the back of that, we'll talk a little bit about why this was developed, like I said, in the first place, the need for this particular type of tool. And I'll tell you guys about the toolkit and handbook, give you guys a little bit of a flavor for it. And then at the end, I will tell you guys about what practitioners have said to us, how this bit of work has impacted their practice. So first of all, I just want to highlight the fact, so MACE, of course, stands for Multiple Adverse Childhood Experiences. So I'll tell you guys about the MACE CAUT sort of project, and because they were the people who commissioned this bit of work. So I'll tell you guys about that in a moment. But first of all, I think nobody who is on this webinar today is unfamiliar with the idea that adverse childhood experiences and other potential sources of childhood trauma are prevalent, right, on the island of Ireland. So you can see here a prevalent study done here in Northern Ireland with youth ages 11 to 19. So you can see the rates rather that respondents have said that they have experienced particular ACEs, with about 50% or just under 50% experiencing at least one ACE, which is more or less in line with the Welsh data, which was widely used in Northern Ireland, well, still is widely used in Northern Ireland, alongside this specific bit of data that comes from our population. Right? And as I said, this is a bit of cross-border work. So for the Republic of Ireland, you can see there a population level study that shows the ACE prevalence in Irish adults aged 18 and up. And you can see about 65% of the population said they've experienced at least one ACE, and the prevalence of other ACEs as listed there. So again, like I said, I don't think this is news to anybody that this is a significant and known issue amongst our population. So the MACE Toolkit and Handbook were commissioned by the CAUT MACE project. So CAUT stands for Cooperation and Working Together, and you can see the project partners on the left-hand side in that bottom image. So this is PHA, health trusts, two different health trusts, Western and Southern, and down south, Health Service Executive and TUSLA, and then Health and Social Care Board here in Northern Ireland as well. So as I said, this is a cross-border project funded by the EU Interreg VA funding. And the aim of this project is to transform the lives of vulnerable families at risk from multiple adversities through identification, early intervention, and provision of support within the community. So the MACE project, they have some funded interventions, and then there's this side of the project. So for this particular side of the project, what they were looking for was a tool and training to help practitioners identify families at risk of multiple adversities, MACE, or to help better support those that they were already working with, right? And so that's where we come in. So we were commissioned, ASCERT were commissioned for this particular piece of work. So some of you might say, listen, everybody knows ACEs are a problem. This is an issue. Why don't you just do an ACE checklist? She's there, she's ready to go. Why don't you just give people an ACE checklist? And the reason for that is that routine ACE screening isn't really sufficient for this type of work, for trauma-informed work, right? And some of you might be saying, oh, what are you talking about? And I will tell you a little, I'll justify myself here a little bit, right? So essentially we would say that for trauma-informed practice, just going through an ACE checklist with somebody isn't sufficient for a number of reasons. First of all, ACE checklists are essentially confined to the 10 adversities that have been studied ever since the original CDC Kaiser Permanente ACE study in 1998. So a very fixed 10, there's a lot of stuff that could be a potential source of childhood trauma that we would be leaving out. For example, things like the troubles, right, or the impact of the conflict here, right? That'd be a huge omission. ACE checklists simply measure exposure and not frequency, timing, intensity, or duration, which can all have an effect or an impact rather on how an exposure potentially affects somebody. And there's no measurement of protective factors, right? It's a very sort of deficit approach if you are solely using an ACE checklist. And as other people have talked about today already, all of our fabulous speakers have talked about today, is that we really want to take a strengths-based approach to this particular work. And that includes taking a look at protective factors. One of the reasons why protective factors are so important is because, and people have kind of touched on this today as well, when we talk about the definition of trauma, is that how somebody experiences a particular exposure to something that could be potentially traumatic is going to be largely influenced by risk and protective factors that are present prior to, during, and after exposure to a particular event. And if we don't measure those protective factors, we aren't going to get a true picture of what exposure to something potentially traumatic might mean for that individual. And frankly, as I said, I'm a public health professional, right? And ACE research is public health research at its core, right? And the issue with public health research, and if any of you have attended ACE training with me before or trauma training with me before, you'll be familiar with this rant. So sorry, you can take a nap for the next 30 seconds. But public health research aims to ask, or a lot of public health research aims to ask, does there appear to be a relationship between one thing and another thing, right? And if there is, what do we do with that relationship? So the original ACE study, which was done with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is, like I said, proof in the pudding that it is public health research, aimed to ask, does there seem to be a relationship between exposure and adversity in childhood and negative health outcomes throughout the lifespan? The answer was yes. And so the question is, what do we do about that? Do we change policies? Do we put early intervention in place? Do we put funding for early intervention for services, right? Problem with taking public health research and trying to apply it to individuals, it doesn't quite translate correctly, right? You see this with other types of public health tools. BMI is a great example of this, where great population level tool, but when applied to individuals can get a bit wonky. Right? When people tend to go through ACE checklists with people tend to freak out, for lack of a better term. You know, they'll see that they've checked 6 ACEs and like, oh my gosh, you know, what does this mean for me? I'm gonna get heart disease, I'm gonna get cancer, I'm gonna smoke crack. My goodness, that's not what this means, right? ACE research tells us that there is a relationship between adversity in childhood and health outcomes throughout the lifespan, and the question is, what do we do about that, right? So, well, we can't necessarily say, well, listen, ACE checklist doesn't work. Well, that's us. Nothing to do, right? We can't say that. We got to come up with something else. And that is what we aim to do as part of this work. So the idea is then that we want a tool and a training course to encourage people to be trauma informed in their practice. And I'm not going to labor this too much. You guys have heard already enough fantastic about what being trauma informed means. But the way that I explain it to my trainees in MACE, in the MACE course, is that we are understanding that traumatic experiences are common. We're integrating an understanding of how trauma can affect somebody as a whole person, not just psychologically or emotionally, which is what most people think about when they think about trauma. And we're also thinking about how that can influence the relationship between the service user and ourselves, right? First, if they engage with us in the first place, but also what they might need from us whenever they do work with us. And we adjust our service delivery accordingly. And that's really, you know, when it comes to a practitioner's perspective of trauma-informed practice, that's why I tell them, you know, if this is your first time hearing about this, that's essentially what it is, right? We're acknowledging trauma's out there and we might be affected by it. We might be bringing our own experiences of trauma into our work. We're thinking about how it can affect people and adjusting our service delivery accordingly. And hopefully Deirdre would agree with me that that's essentially, you know, if you took what she kind of talked about, it's kind of boiling that down into 3 bullet points, that could be it, right? And throughout the MACE course and the MACE Toolkit and Handbook are all meant to go through each of those steps. Right. So I'm not telling people this in the beginning of the training and being like, oh, figure it out for yourself. Right. So we go through each bit of this, and the toolkit and handbook are intended to help people with this. So what are the toolkit and handbook then? So for this particular piece of work, there are 2 resources. So there is the MACE Trauma Informed Practitioners Toolkit, and there is the handbook. So you can see in the photos there on the left-hand side is the handbook and the right-hand side is the toolkit. And I'll tell you guys a little bit more about them here now. So the idea for the toolkit was that it would be an easy to use and practical tool for identifying children potentially affected by ACEs and trauma and ideas for support. The handbook then is essentially a guidance document for people who are using the toolkit, aka I couldn't squish everything into a toolkit because then people would be lugging around a big old thing. But there's other stuff that people need to know if they're going to be using things like the toolkit. So it's where I get to expand upon the stuff that I talk about in the toolkit, but also adjacent topics. And I'll tell you guys a little bit about that in a moment. So the toolkit then is a companion document that's meant to be used alongside a practitioner's usual assessment forms if they do carry out assessments or during other relevant work. Right. The way that I explain it to my trainees is that, you know, aid memoir probably would have been a better name for it, but we couldn't use that. Apparently it was taken up. But like I said, it's something that is meant to enhance their knowledge, right? Something that they can have sitting next to them when they're going through their work. Maybe something that they can refer to, you know, what's the sort of things I should be tuned in about, right? What's the sort of stuff I should be looking behind? If any of you are attending this webinar today who have gone through this training, you'll know that phrase, looking behind. I say it so much in training, you probably hear it in your sleep in my accent, which I apologize for. So there's two different versions of the toolkit. There's an early years version, which is that sort of 0 to 5 age range, and the school age and adolescence version, which is 6 to 18 plus. The remit for this particular work was focused on children, but of course, listen, when we're working with children, we're not just working with children, we're working with adults in their life as well, parents, carers, other sort of people surrounding them who they themselves might be affected by trauma. So the stuff that is included in the school age and adolescence version can be applied to adults as well. But like I said, because of the remit, this work is focused on children. So the idea behind the toolkit was to make practitioners in all relevant professions, in other words, those working with children and families. And I just want to say, being trauma informed isn't just for people in social work or healthcare or social services or anything like that, right? This is for people working with people. If you are working with people, you are going to benefit from being trauma informed, whether you work at the front desk of a hotel, all the way up to the CEO of the PHA, he's gone now, so I can say that. Like anybody working with people is going to benefit from this, right? So the idea behind it is we want to make people more aware of the potential causes and signs of traumatic stress in children and potentially adults too, if you apply it that way, right? And also those protective factors and other supports for the reasons that I mentioned there earlier. And the idea is then that if you take that more balanced view, that more whole picture approach, you're not just coming from a deficit and risk focused approach, but you're taking a look at those protective factors as well, right? We have a better view. We're going to be better equipped to choose appropriate interventions or play the support pathway if you are in a position to do so. So that's what the toolkit looks like. That's cover page. Like I said, we have the school age and adolescents, that 6 to 18 plus, in their early years version, which is that 0 to 5. So what I'm going to do is I'll quickly talk you through the contents of the toolkit, just give you a brief overview. So the toolkit starts out with some sort of helpful tips or do's and don'ts for carrying out trauma-informed assessments, right? And again, it's a lot of the stuff you guys have already heard from people today, right? Things like encouraging active participation, taking a collaborative approach is a huge part of this particular piece of work. And, you know, Deirdre's already explained to you why that's so important, right? Or avoiding things like, you know, taking a really prescriptive approach or, you know, I'm the practitioner, so I know best, right? We've all heard that, haven't we? Right? Avoiding that, right? There's also a reminder as well that to be aware that our own experiences can influence the way that we see clients and ourselves. And so that's another reason why things like supervision are so important, to be reflective, self-reflective in our practice. From there, practitioners are highlighted some sort of potential sources of childhood trauma. Now, of course, these lists aren't exhaustive. It would be impossible for me to squish all of that into one thing, but just some common potential sources of trauma. So for example, you have your original 10 ACEs, you know, the stuff you'd find on an ACE checklist. But also stuff like bullying, troubles or conflict-related trauma, either experienced directly during the conflict, intergenerationally, experiencing the stuff that still exists that has roots in the conflict. Things like difficulty with family cohesion, right? Things like violence in the community. right? So another bit of this toolkit really, what it really intends to do is to highlight the fact that adversity and trauma aren't just things that happen within the home, right? And sometimes people get really focused on that. Well, they just think about the things that happen with the individual or their family, and they won't take a bigger picture view of the things that happen in the community. Structural considerations, right? Things like structural racism, right? Funding, right? All of these sorts of big, again, like I said, I'm a public health professional, so I always have to push these bits in, but these sorts of bigger picture things are stuff that people don't think about when they think about potential sources of trauma, or how things that happen within the home can be influenced by those bigger picture things, right? So things, the potential sources in the community environment are included as well. And of course, then there's the potential signs of traumatic stress in the little box there. And again, I explain to my trainees, these are potential signs. And what I tell them is that, you know, some of these things, most people aren't in tune. You know, if a child says my tummy hurts, most people just say, they ate a crayon when I wasn't looking and now their tummy hurts, right? But what I always tell people is that, you know, kids who are really little, they don't have the language to say I'm stressed or I'm anxious, right? And so a lot of times it sounds like my tummy hurts. But what I tell them is that, listen, if you're seeing things like that, you want to look behind them. I always tell my trainees, don't walk away from today assuming that any of this stuff is absolutely trauma, but I also don't want you ignoring it either, right? Don't ignore, don't assume, but look behind. I'm tuning you in, but I don't want you to assume anything, right? And again, that highlights that collaborative working, right? We're working with them to decide, to determine rather, what's going on for that individual, rather than us saying, I'm the practitioner, I'm the gatekeeper of all knowledge, right? And all experience. From there, they are prompted to consider resilience and protective factors. So I acknowledge that some people don't like the language of resilience, which is fine, but in training, I always say, listen, I wanted to call it the good stuff, but the good stuff wasn't professional enough to get printed on a toolkit. So the good stuff to look out for, so you can kind of see those there. And again, I highlight to people, looking behind applies to this stuff too, right? Sometimes you'll see certain behaviors or presentations where you're like, hey, this person's really coping or they're unaffected, but maybe if you dig a little deeper, it might be a bit of a, you know, a front, for a lack of a better term, right? And we discussed that a little bit within training as well. And again, you can see those key points for acknowledging strengths. Again, making sure that's a co-productive, cooperative approach, and that's highlighted again within that as well. From there, practitioners are prompted to think about then. So the way we kind of talk about thinking about, you know, risk and protection is we liken it to a seesaw, which comes from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. They sort of explain it that way. And so the way we kind of talk about it, we think, you know, we want to think about, when we think about supports and we think about, you know, the support pathway plating, which I'll show you guys in a second. The way we sort of think about it is we like to think about it as like a seesaw. How does the risk and adversity side of things balance out with the protection and resilience, quote unquote, side of things, right? And we want to put a lot of weight on that good stuff side to outweigh or mitigate the impact of the risk and adversity that somebody might be experiencing or have experienced. So this is where they're sort of prompted to think about that. They are explained to the sort of levels of intervention. You can kind of see those examples there. So we talk a little bit about that within the course. And then the last bit is where we kind of put it all together and we talk about support pathway planning. So we talk about, again, this being a co-productive effort, the practitioner sitting down and thinking, all right, you know, what's working for you? You can kind of see there, we come to this with the goal of reducing stress, increasing capacity for people to deal with stress and trauma, and improving relationships within the home and community. So we think about that by saying, you know, what's currently in your life that could contribute to that, including like non-specialist stuff, like this could be relationships with friends, right? Or things like that. It's not just all about really, you know, high-level interventions or anything like that. Thinking about goal setting from the perspective of the client or family or whatever phrase you want to use, right? So again, this is led by them, informed by them, right? And then being able to review it, right? So again, planning supports and things like that, all in relationship or in cooperation with that family. Gone are the days of us making all the decisions on our own, right? We need to try to involve people as much as we reasonably can, right? And this is very much highlighting that, right? So that is the crash course and the toolkit. I'll tell you guys in a little bit where you can sort of sign up to this training if you're eligible, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end. So that's what the fancy professionally printed version of the toolkit looks like. Not pictured as me sitting on the floor, hunched over like a little gremlin, putting the the key rings in place to connect all these pages together, because nobody wants to see that. But that is what the toolkit looks like. So she's fancy, right? It looks great in my opinion. And then, of course, the handbook goes on the other side of this. So that is where, like I said, I talk about all the stuff I couldn't squish into a toolkit. So you can see things like, the ACE prevalence, again, across the island of Ireland. Things like explaining the sort of mechanism of action of how ACEs appear to influence health throughout the lifespan. Toxic stress and brain development. What is trauma-informed practice? A little shout out to the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland with their trauma lens. And then again, expanding on the sorts of things that we talk about within the toolkit throughout the sort of middle section of the handbook. And then towards the end, looking at impact of trauma work on the practitioner. So things like potential signs of secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, and organizational support and self-care for practitioners working with trauma, right? So we were asked for a robust resource, and I think we gave it. It's about 50 pages long, but I think it's easily read. I tried to write it in a way that made it easy and entertaining to read, but you can kind of see some sample pages there. So what that looks like. Like I said, I think it's an interesting and informative bit of work. There's about 85 citations in it, so so a good resource, I think, for finding other sort of sources, but like I said, hopefully useful for people who are using the toolkit. So as I said, I wasn't tasked with just writing the toolkit and handbook. We also have a training to go with it. So we have a 3.5-hour course that covers the stuff that we talk about in the toolkit and handbook. And then the trainees also get to practice sort of using the toolkit in a group setting using case scenarios before they go out into the big bad world and use it for real. So this has been going on now. So we delivered it to just over 500 people. So this whole thing initially started, we were initially commissioned to do this in about October of 2020, which sounds like 100 years ago, but it wasn't that long. So we did our sort of first pilots in April of 2021, and then the full-fledged version of the training in April of 2021. So delivered to just over 500 people there. So really, really happy to report that. And I love delivering the course. And like I said, if any of you have attended it, you know how much I love delivering it. And then we also have a training for trainers. So again, for people who have been through the toolkit course to go out and deliver it where, listen, if I was the only person, I'd be worn out. So we have to have other people to go out and deliver it within their areas and within their organizations to further spread the word of this particular bit of work. So again, 3.5-hour course. We go into stuff that we might not necessarily get to go into in the main course. That's still covered within the handbook, but is good for the trainers to know when they're communicating this stuff. So, for example, why is an ACE checklist insufficient for this sort of work? And we get to go into a little bit more in-depth discussion with that sort of stuff. So it can't be just me saying, hey, this is great, because I wrote it, so that would be really biased. So I want you guys to know a little bit more about what people have said to me, how this has influenced the way that they see their practice and the way that they carry out their practice. And just some selected things here. People say, enhance my practice and compassion with people that I work with. My goodness, I love reading that, right? If I have helped somebody clue in on their compassion and their empathy, oh my goodness, that's me done, right? Improving collaboration, taking a strengths-based approach, taking more time to think, right? Again, gone are the days of us making assumptions, right? A greater understanding of awareness of how trauma can affect people, a greater understanding of how to change and reframe how we engage with other people, changing our practice, right? Being more aware of reasons for behavior and having better empathy, right? We talk all the time, like, listen, you might see stuff that you might see as quote unquote challenging behavior, bad, quote unquote bad behavior. We're changing the way that we see those things, right? It's science-based, seeing that trauma is not a failure or individualized issue, understanding inequality, poverty, social exclusion, right? Again, that public health focus. And again, the strengths-based approach, and people seem to think I'm all right delivering the course itself. So, again, like I said, this is the stuff I like to hear, right? People are changing, fundamentally changing how they see the people they work with. So you can see there, talking about being more reflective, trauma-focused, being more focused on recovery, right? Again, recovery from trauma is possible. It's a huge message that we have with this bit of work, right? And seeing that, again, reflected in practice is brilliant. And so for our training for trainers as well, it has gone out to, I know they're to counseling students, nursing, health and social care, National Adoption Service, social workers, public health nurses. These are these sorts of groups that this training is going out to, beyond me, the people who have been training for trainers, or T for T'd, as we call it sometimes, right? So I told you, woo, that was quick, wasn't it? It's already been 30 minutes. So hang on 30 minutes, man. So if any of you, so like I said, the MACE project is currently restricted to border county areas, right? So if you, hopefully you guys remember that little map there. So essentially, you guys know what a border county area is. So any sort of border county area, that is where this training is restricted to at the minute, just because of the funding. So if you are a practitioner in one of the border county areas, like I said, either in Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland, you can see there that Caitlin McGill at westerntrust.hscni.net, she is the person who helps coordinate people signing up to this course. So like I said, if you are in the border county areas, that is an absolute requirement. Please feel free to email Caitlin. Otherwise, if you go to ASCERT.biz, we do have a section on our training page, which has the dates for MACE training, and it also has her email address there again. So check out that page, like I said, if you're interested in enrolling in that course, and it'll also show you the information that you need to share with Caitlin in order to enroll. So do email her there, but of course there is me as well. But I'll take a look here and see if anybody, it's so strange being the host, and then being like, okay, does anybody have any questions for me? So I'll take a look and see if there is anyway there. So reached out with training and hadn't heard back. All the trainings are full. They shouldn't be all full. So, so Christina, if you will email Caitlin McGill and let her know, she will be able to let you know about the training there. So have that there. So while we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions, do the panelists have any questions for me while we're waiting on that? Or does that all make sense? Hopefully.
Maybe, Elena, a question. I think, thank you. That's an interesting presentation and a very practical way in which you can use a toolkit to become trauma informed. Is there a particular example you might offer about how someone has maybe hit a barrier trying to implement this and maybe has overcome it?
I've never had anyone tell me that they have. I suppose because the toolkit is all about, it's really more about changing your ways of thinking, right? So it's more about, you know, there's what you might want to look out for, right? And again, being aware of the potential sources of trauma, potential signs of trauma, the potential protective factors, and being more in tune with those, and therefore applying them to your practice. Again, changing your service delivery accordingly. So a lot of the toolkits and handbook materials have to do more in here almost, and again, how you change your practice accordingly. Of course, when it comes to trauma-informed, I think I would be amiss to not say this. Of course, with trauma-informed practice, when we're focused on the individual practitioner, I always bring this up in my course, is that all individual practitioners are unfortunately going to be restricted by organizational any organizational rules. If there's limited periods of time that people can work with their clients, like there's only so much as within an individual practitioner's control. So I think with the toolkit, it's very much focused on changing that person's perspective, and therefore how they carry forward with their practice. So barriers don't seem to be too much. I mean, I haven't been told about too many. I do follow-ups with people after training for approximately 6 weeks post-training, and nobody has complained. So if they have had issues, they haven't told me. But people have, told me about being able to use it and stuff. So like I said, hopefully with that focus, because I think we kind of, whenever we were writing this bit of work as well, I wanted to acknowledge that, yeah, I mean, we're all, as individuals, we're all restricted by sort of bigger picture. And that's why it's great where there's like Orla and Deirdre and stuff coming in with that organizational stuff, because it's needed. You can't just change the minds of an individual practitioner and hope to make big change. There has to be change on those bigger sort of levels, organizationally, and like I said, policy wise and things like that. But again, that's a lot of my perspective as a public health practitioner there. So just get some. So does that answer your question, Kevin? Brilliant. So got some questions. So again, I will put in the answer here. So can't talk and type at the same time.
Yeah. I think, Elena, there's one question there around, difficult conversations and stress is an inevitable part of introducing change, and where the goal is, better culture, responsive services and happier staff. The question was, do you think that other initiatives like investors and people overlap with becoming trauma informed? I suppose just briefly, I would wonder on that. I think one of the key messages about trauma-informed practice is how it links to existing priorities. And that's something that we really want to, emphasize, for organizations. And it's not just investors and people, but I think as well, if you look at all the HSC QI work, if you look at all the quality improvement work, we want to have a culture of safety, a culture of continuous learning, lived experience at the center, what matters to you. So I think the whole collective leadership strategy as well. Yes, absolutely. We need leadership, being explicit about a commitment to this, but equally leadership's the responsibility of all. So I think there are lots of existing, policies and procedures and drives, within various organizations. And I think trauma-informed practice in many ways complements and links to existing priorities. That's just one comment I wanted to make regarding that question. Other people may have other comments.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's multiple bits to this puzzle, and there's one question that's been kind of sitting here so it's not directly based off of mine, but I do want to acknowledge it because I kind of mentioned it before. But somebody was asking there about the impact of privilege as well as adversity on staff responsiveness. Our own unacknowledged trauma can impact the quality of how we engage with service users, but so can unacknowledged privilege, not having an awareness of social class, gender, racial inequalities, and how complicit we are in maintaining these equalities. And yeah, absolutely. That's why we talk about, like I said, I talk about it in the handbook and I talk about it in the course and things like that, as well as that, like I said, sometimes whenever we talk about trauma, being responsive or informed or, whatever, like I said, language you guys want to use. Like I said, sometimes there's this more significant focus on, like I said, the individual and, things like that, where, I really sort of push people within the course to consider, like I said, those larger sort of structural considerations, the policies and community and how all those bigger picture things can influence, trauma and experience of trauma and whether or not somebody experiences something as traumatic. We talk in the course about resisting re-traumatization. We kind of talk about what that might look like. We talk about, things like, not using things like, cultural, like, being culturally competent, and not leaning on, not engaging rather in discriminatory policies and things like that. So we do talk about that a bit in the course. And I think it's one that is a thing that I think people are becoming more aware of, and the importance of that. And like I said, especially, here in this country, there are certain divides and things like that, that can be seen and this sort of work. So again, I think a lot of people, are becoming more aware of that, right, within this particular bit of work. Well, if nobody else has any other questions for me, then we will go ahead and take our last break. So again, thank you guys so much for that. And like I said, hopefully you found that interesting and informative. And like I said, please feel free to contact myself or Caitlin if you are interested in attending that training, if you are in the border county areas. But what we'll do is we will go ahead and take our last break. And then when we come back, we will have our final speaker, Mags, will be telling us about the community resiliency model. And then we will have closing statements by Kevin Bailey. So again, thank you guys so much. And we will be back in about 10 minutes. I had my little countdown clock there for the last one, decided to stop working. Like right since I was like, I was clicking it and it just wasn't working. I was like, all right, like gotta give up on this thing. But all right, well, hopefully everybody is more or less back from that little break, because we have the last of our main speakers. So we're going to get to hear from Mags Johnston. So she's coming to us from Discover U, Northern Ireland. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about the community resiliency model. And as I said, after that, we'll have our closing, we'll have question and answer time, of course, with Mags, and we will have our closing remarks with Kevin. But before we get to that, like I said, let's all get ready to hear about CRM. So Mags, over to you.
Thanks very much, Elena. Nearly forgot to take off the mute. I think someone said that earlier. We spent years now doing that. You're on mute, you're on mute. Nearly forgot to. So thank you very much. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. It's lovely to know that there are so many of you that have come along today. I'm Margaret, or Mags. I know you won't be doing too much interaction with me, but you can take your pick. I've been called a lot worse with either of those names. It is really lovely to be here today. Fantastic listening to other speakers. This really is, they really make it a hard act to follow. But a big thank you to Aidan and Orla and Deirdre and Elena and Kevin thus far. I've got the last shift, which can very much be a bit of a graveyard shift. So hopefully I won't have lost too many of you. I am not going to take too long at all, too much of your time. I also have, like Elena, got about 30 minutes. I'm going to pop up my presentation. You all see that okay? Yep. So thank you again. I suppose by way of starting, my remit was to focus on wellbeing in the workplace and supporting wellbeing in the workplace. And I'll probably talk a little bit about that, but I will also talk beyond that. I guess it'll make sense as it unfolds. However, I am inviting you that when I talk about the community resiliency model today, to use the 4R approach that Orla and Deirdre talked about. So I'm going to ask you and invite you to look at CRIM, to realise that you could learn CRIM from your own perspective, that you could recognise how it would fit in with you and your self-care regime, that you could respond to the CRIM as I talked to you today about choosing the bits that maybe might work for you, because CRIM is very invitational, and I'll talk about that. There's loads in it and it is really invitational. And then that maybe by using CRIM that you could resist and prevent further upset for yourself, because you'll have been able to pop it into your self-care wellbeing toolkit with the other stuff that you have in there, hopefully to keep yourself well. And then ultimately that you could pass it on to others. So my half-hour session is a little bit about getting your hands dirty, but making sure when you do, then what does that look like for you, and then potentially what does that look like for colleagues and family and friends and the clients that you support. So it is about helping you help others. And in my usual way, I'm going to even ask you to strip away just organisations that we've talked about today, the big powerhouses, the policies, the structures, the systems, because yes, they're all very important, but I'm just going to invite you to strip them away, because when I listen to Deirdre and I listen to Elena, it's the simple stuff that helps us help others. It's the stuff that you don't really learn at school, the empathy and the trust and reaching out to others and understanding. And then you don't get that in school, a lot of this stuff. So I'm asking to strip away the big stuff today and just focus on the next kind of half hour with me on you and how you are a carer for you before then you become a carer for others, I suppose. So I'm here in the capacity today as a certified community resiliency model teacher trainer, otherwise known throughout the rest of the session as CRIM. And that's owned by the Trauma Resource Institute, which is an American organisation. I've split my talk into kind of 3 sections, but I am a hail for trying to ram lots of information into short spaces of time, because CRIM's great and I've got lots to give you. So I am going to give you a little bit of information on Trauma Resource Institute up front here. You can see on the first slide, because this obviously isn't mine, it's Trauma Resource Institute's. It's Elaine Miller Carris's. You can see her name here. She's the co-founder of TRI, and she is the creator of the Trauma Resiliency Model and the Community Resiliency Model I'll be talking to you about CRIM today. And a brilliant precursor, if you're wanting to know anything more else about CRIM, a brilliant precursor is Elaine's book, The Building Resilience to Trauma. Great book, can pick it up for a few pounds on Amazon, and it really is a great starter for 10. I'm conscious we have a short time, and I am going to try and give you as much information as I can today. So I'd invite you just to, if you've pen and paper, doodle away. And if there's questions, I can maybe pick one or two up at the end. If there's deeper questions, we can take them away, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you offline. So my aim for today is to give you this threefold. Some information on Trauma Resource Institute, some information high level on the CRIM and my introduction to it and what it has meant to me, a sort of a boots on the ground working with it as well for me and for my clients, and then a whistle-stop tour of the CRIM, the model itself. So a bit about me and really actually why are you here and how do you belong with all of your other learned colleagues? Well, I'm just very simply a trainer and a coach with my own little simple organisation, Discover UNI, and it does what it says on the tin, helping people discover themselves again. I have an absolute avid interest and a huge passion, which has been burning now for a lot of years, for all things mental health, well-being, impact of stress and trauma related. Those topics fascinate me. I have an even bigger passion for helping others take back control of their lives, helping people to move forward from mental ill health, from stresses and traumas that have been holding them captive, helping them to explore, embrace and enable, I suppose, their true selves, which I know is very cliche, but it's very poignant and very strong, because people do lose themselves with mental ill health, stress and trauma in and out of the workplace, our family, our friends, our colleagues, our clients. People do lose themselves, they lose their voice, they lose their self-esteem, they lose their value and their image, they lose everything about themselves sometimes. The pieces become very fragmented, because we know that's exactly what stress and trauma can do. It fragments the psyche of a person. So I help people to lean into ways of building tailored wellbeing plans. And it's not easy, but it is absolutely doable. And CRIM can help big style with that. Oh, all right. Oh, forgot. So on now to kind of the first sort of bit of this about the Trauma Resource Institute. You can check them out on traumaresourceinstitute.com. It's a non-profit organisation, American, devoted to cultivating trauma-informed and resiliency-focused individuals and communities throughout the world. I know the slide is wordy, but I just want to share as much as I can. So Elaine's vision was very much to create a biological-based intervention that was accessible, portable, affordable, and adaptable to everyone. And the TRI team to date have gone into over 100 countries around the world with CRIM. It's widely used with individuals and communities that have been marginalised by economic challenges, natural and human-made disasters. And when I think of human-made disasters, and I think of the continuing story of 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people, not just in Northern Ireland or UK or island of Ireland, but globally struggling to date with mental health problems and conditions and stresses and traumas. Well, this reminds and reinforces me of how very much needed, very simplistic interventions like CRIM are needed. As I say, not just for clients, but for us, because we can build stuff like this into our self-care toolboxes. So a little bit about CRIM then. And I have a little heart in my notes. I'll be very open and honest because I smile when I look at my notes. I am following my notes to make sure I stay on point because I have a habit of diversing when I get very passionate about things. So CRIM is evidence-informed intervention to help children, adolescents, adults, families, communities in the aftermath of extremely stressful and traumatic events. So it is trauma-informed, but brilliantly more so, it is resiliency focused, because that's where the attention will go. Yes, there is cutting edge science weaved in and out of CRIM, but it's done in an easy to way understand. There are 6 wellness skills to help an individual recognise signs of stress, trauma and distress. And these skills very much help people take back control, because to me that's what it's all about. A lot of the time is taking back control, not relying on me as a coach, not relying on you as a helper, but taking back control to manage, regulate and stabilise their autonomic nervous system. Teaching the art of being able to move from states of distress and chaos that sometimes goes within the internal churn to states of calmness and wellness can just be brilliant, I suppose. And CRIM opens up an opportunity to becoming self-aware. We talk about, you know, big words like this all of the time, but CRIM really does open up that opportunity. It invites independence and it helps, above all, people to learn how to self-regulate and to self-soothe. I mean, Gabor Mate talks about this all day long. It's so important that we learn to pull on coping mechanisms, self-soothing ones that serve us better, I suppose, than some of the coping mechanisms that some of us do use and pull on at times of distress. It's recognising that our reactions to stress and trauma are biologically based and not in any way a sign of mental, emotional, physical weakness. And this, when I've done CRIM, has been the biggest learning curve, the biggest game changer for people and for myself, actually. There are 2 pathways, if you're interested at all, for you or your organisation today that you could go down after today for CRIM. So you could take a couple of people in your organisation and undertake the accredited training programme to become, like myself, a certified community resiliency model teacher trainer. And the TRI team are now offering this face-to-face, obviously, and online, unless you fancy a little trip to the USA, particularly Barbados, where they seem to do a lot of the training sometimes. So it could be a really good excuse to get away, folks, and get a bit of sun. A good wellbeing plan there, actually. Have a word with your boss. And that would enable you to deliver CRIM training workshops. Or, let's keep this even simpler. You could come along to a CRIM workshop, pick up the skills, become a CRIM guide, and share it on a one-to-one basis. So my introduction leads me into my introduction to CRIM. You know, everything for a reason in life, I say, the good stuff especially, because I was very privileged to become part of an organisation who back in 2018, 2019, as Elena said a little while ago, seems like a lifetime ago actually, way before COVID, but this organisation started on a journey of creating a more trauma-informed workplace. So I was very fortunate to have lived and breathed a little bit of this today. And that organisation was Victim Support NI. I was their training manager for a few years. Fabulous organisation. I have very close connections still today, which is great. And Victim Support use the psychological first aid model as part of their support model, which is great. It's a vital first step to offering basic care, comfort and support to victims of crime. But Victim Support were very keen back then to expand their support model. And after a little bit of research and digging in and out, I wasn't part of this. They chose the Trauma Resource Institute's community resiliency model, and it dovetailed perfectly into their support model. September 19, a team of 4 of us in Victim Support joined about 20 other delegates from all around the world. We all trundled off to Dunkirk Gardens, NICFA, and the TRI team actually came to Belfast, which was brilliant, quite rare, but they came along to Belfast, and we spent that week becoming certified CRIM teachers. within a lock of weeks, Jerry Hanna, our chief executive then, kind of was very keen that we were up and running as quickly as possible, which was great. So within a matter of weeks, we were in phase 1 rollout of CRIM to our staff and volunteers, supporting them before supporting others, and how we wanted to invite them to look at CRIM and add it to their toolbox. Now, 6 months into that, we were on a sort of 12 to 18 month journey. 6 months into that, COVID struck. So it was a great opportunity to pull on our own resiliency skills, to pull on some CRIM. We lifted it and we pushed it online, and we spent a lot of the time rolling it out online. A bit like Elena, it's always good to hear from other people's mouths, you know, how good is this CRIM? I can talk to you for half an hour, but what do other people say? So Julena, a great colleague, ex-colleague of mine and good friend, I would call her, hope she would call me the same, give me this lovely feedback on how it has been a journey of learning and discovery for the organisation of the people that they help. Been an invaluable tool to help people understand the impact of trauma, gives them the tools to take back control and not become defined by what happened to them. Because we can't undo what has happened. So it's about what are we doing now for moving forward. And I say phase 1 for victim support because I know they continue to keep CRIM on the radar, offering ongoing training to new and existing staff and volunteers. So having left victim support, I wear CRIM now with 3 hats in 3 different ways. CRIM features very much on ASCERT's training and education programmes. I'm very grateful. I work as an associate with ASCERT. Colin has been very good to me, took me under his wing and allows me to roll out CRIM sessions. I do that quite often to healthcare, social care and community voluntary people, because again, I don't care what role that you do. CRIM is all about you embedding it for you before you kind of help others. I go out with a CRIM buddy and her and I would go out offering in my second hat CRIM to workplace and community settings. And then as a life, mental health and wellbeing coach, I have a privilege of being able to pull CRIM from a lot of other modalities that I also use, but I can use CRIM in one-to-one settings with people. So I thought I'd just pop up a few other comments from other people that I've worked with from other organisations. Just again, it's always good to see some proof in the pudding. Content of the session was relevant and interesting on both a personal and professional basis. CRIM skills can be used to help people understand the biology behind why they acted in a particular way when trauma occurred. I enjoyed all elements of CRIM training and found it very useful for work with my clients, and so on and so on. I'll just let you take another few seconds to read through some of the other comments. Which takes me into this little slide here. And as mentioned, I am and I have a huge passion for all things mental health, well-being, stress and trauma related. It's kind of my niche now. I learn every day. I'll learn for the rest of my life because things change all the time. People change all the time, but this is me and this is what I do. And Elaine's quote really resonates with me because we have the inner capacity to heal. We absolutely do. And working it from the inside out can prove invaluable. So I've spent the past few years working with clients one-to-one, small, medium, large group basis with the likes of victim support. This last year, very concentrated with Nexus. I had a wonderful year with them, supporting about 25 to 30 clients with the Victim and Survivors Trust and with various other women's centres. So I've been very privileged in the work that I do, working with lots of different people. And I love being able to hold space and to hold hope for those guys while they move through their journeys, coming out of the back of mental ill health problems, conditions and impacts of stresses and traumas. And I'm reminded, and I always appreciate, because we do cover this in CRIM, that life has ups and downs. No one is getting out of this without experiencing downs. You know, that there's not a spiritual book in the world that says life will be happy 24/7, 365. It doesn't happen. There are ups and downs within us, our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our sensations. There are ups and downs outside of us. Those aces that Elena talked about, those events that I have learned that usually come from the hands of another, unfortunately. And as Bessel van der Kolk will say, the body keeps the score. And it holds secrets, and it can hold us captive. And whilst I am boundaried in my role, I've become very aware of the myriad of rotten downs that people experience. But models like CRIM help people take control back. It can help people to heal, restore, discover, and rediscover without a shadow of a doubt. But I will put a caveat here as well, that CRIM is not a one-stop shop. It's not a be-all and end-all. And it's not a substitute for coaching or other talking therapy interventions. But that goes for all modalities. They're not all one-stop shops. But it is a great tool that definitely has a place in the overall wellness toolkit of an individual. Definitely something that they could pop in there. And the model is a refreshing change for me from other modalities, I have to say, because Elena talks about looking behind and CRIM talks about looking within. It is a bottom-up approach. The target area is the nervous system. So it makes a wee change from the 3-4 pound mass between your ears that we're so used to looking at sometimes, because hey ho, that's where mental health is. That's where stress and trauma is. No, it's not, because the body keeps the score. So let's look at where it does impact, and it impacts the nervous system as well. The audience, it can be used with everyone. Focus is about identifying sensations, well-being and stress. The aim is to learn how to regulate your nervous system and return it to a state of balance. Even if that's only momentarily, it means you're still taking back control. The goal is to deepen resiliency levels and develop a sense of well-being. Who wouldn't want that? That doesn't take away the downs in life, by the way, you're still going to get them. But to build resiliency from within, to develop a sense of well-being, to pull on this stuff when we get more downs at us, that's what this is all about. It's about not taking away the past and not stopping what's going to come at you, because it's coming at you. But let's become aware, develop resilience. Whether you like that word or not, it is a word and it exists. And it's about developing a sense of well-being to be able to deal with the stuff when it comes at us a little bit better, or when we do trigger, to deal with it a little bit better. The tools, there are 6 of them, which is lovely because that gives choice. The locus of control, I have another little heart at my notes here, because I know that a lot of the audience will hold this close to heart. The locus of control is the individual. You learning it for yourself, you're in control, then you pass that control to other people when you pass the CRIM skills on. The language used is common to all and simple. A couple of caveats here. It takes time, it takes patience. And as I say to everybody, professional or not, I don't really do the professional things, people are people. This starts with you. When I picked it up in September 19, a lot of it was niche. Some of it I knew. And it took me a good couple of months to CRIMize myself, as I would call it. Because whilst I was rolling it out, I needed to put my money where my mouth was. And I still pull on just a couple of the CRIM bits. I don't use it all. But it really is important that you CRIMize yourself before you would definitely start. So that actually does support a great tool to bring into your organisation to help support the well-being of your staff and your volunteers, because we're asking them to get themselves used to it before they use it with others. Let's do a bit of a whistle stop tour. We'll go through 4 concepts of CRIM. The first stop all day long is resilience. Again, whatever you think of the word is what you think of the word, but it's what we use in CRIM. Because we spend time looking at resilience. And the fact is Elena's MACE is perfect, it just bolts onto this, because we look at you are unique. Even my 4 ACEs and Kevin's could be identical, but how they present will be different because I'm unique. And perception is key. And we look at this in this section, we look at You know, you're shaped by your genetics, your upbringing, and your life experiences. But we also look at that stress and trauma doesn't have to define you. And that your reality, which is only your reality, not the reality, can change, which is great news. So we explore resiliency, we deep dive into it, we appreciate the uniqueness. And it really is when we do the CRIM, even when I do it one-to-one, we still explore this first before we do anything. It's the first step to reclaiming the self. We're looking at the definition, factors, and the building blocks of it for you, not for what a textbook says, not for what the organisation or policy or structure says, but what it's like for you. Elena has her definition, you will have yours. Individual and community's ability to identify and use individual and collective strengths. That's why it's called a community model, because you take it and you pass it on. You share it with others. We look at the resiliency zone, or when people are working with children, we have people that use CRIM with children, it works beautifully with them, we call it the OK zone. And we get people to start recognising, a little bit like window of tolerance almost. A lot of these models blend into each other. But you've got the resiliency zone, and we spend time looking at what do you look like when you're in it? And then what do you look like when you're out of it? What bumps you out and what can be done to get you back in? And that's what we'll explore. We spend a little bit of time wrapping our heads around that. Second concept then is trauma. So we're not getting away from this. We have to look at stress and trauma. And again, perception is key. My trauma is not yours. Where it affects me from the inside out will not affect you. So what does it look like for me? And that's why it's important that you do grasp for you and that you know what it looks like for you, the stresses and the trauma. We look at the impact. We don't share stories. We don't do that in any of our practice. We don't need to share stories because we know that sharing them doesn't necessarily mean moving forward and recovering. There are some modalities where that's needed, that's fine, but we don't do it here. We explore, I love this bit of CRIM. This is one of my favourites, this and one of the skills, which is tracking. We explore the stress response system. We explore the common reactions. And that, for me, whether one-to-one or group, is usually the big utopia. Because we understand, we look at the stress response system and we look at the biological reaction and the fact that it's not a weakness. It's a biological reaction designed to keep you safe. And even if people take nothing else other than that away from a whole session, even that can kickstart a process of reducing shame, guilt and stigma that we will hold on to when we are stressed and traumatized. Because it reminds me here, I've just wrote down 4 examples of the couple of thousand people I've worked with, but 4 examples when we look at stress responses and we look at CRIM and even just knowing this bit, the hope that I can give back. You know, the young guy that I sort of worked with who had been beat up outside a nightclub, altercation, for whatever the reason. And he ran away and beat himself up because he didn't defend himself. He didn't fight back. He ran away, couldn't get his head around it. Or the girl, or the multiple girls even last year I worked with, who had been sexually assaulted, had been raped, and wondered why they froze. They folded, they flopped, you call it what you want. That they lived with it year on year, that they never fought back, that they must have been worthless for not doing so. What would people think of them? Or I work with a couple of people who sadly have had their children taken into care. And every time social services, a member of social services who are only doing their job, every time they present, because they will in that person's life, this lady spits feathers. The anger consumes her. She fights heather, leather and tongue with the person in front of her. Can't relax, totally flips her lid. Can't understand why. or the man who folds up and clams, won't talk, can't get anything out of him, won't go for help because of trouble-related images that are still haunting him. Even those 4 examples, just knowing and doing this session on stress response system, stress is not an illness, stress isn't even a condition, it's a biological reaction that's been designed to keep man, woman and child safe. And that the responses that you gave, right, okay, they mightn't have been good all of the time, spitting feathers at social mightn't have been good, mightn't have done you any favours. But we can't control. You couldn't control, because your brain stem did that. It made the choice because it thought you were in mortal danger and it needed to keep you safe for another day. Even that in CRIM has just proved to have worked brilliantly for people to help them to understand why they did and why they react what they did or why they didn't do what they did. Concept 3 is the brain. I love this bit. I love the stress response bit, and I have to say I love the tracking skill. Because as Aristotle says, to know oneself is the beginning of all wisdom. And this is what we're doing with CRIM. We're just giving people back a little bit of wisdom about and knowledge about themselves. So we look at the triune brain. And we look at the roles and responsibilities of each in a very simplistic manner, because it's all connected, the brain, we know that. But the 3 parts of that have different roles and responsibilities, different job descriptions almost. Learning that elegant design, learning that this 3-4 pound mass between your ears, reinforcing to people that there's hope, it's malleable and you can rewire it. You are amazing. You have the capacity to take control of this and change the shape of your neurons. Just because people are never given the chance to think about this. They're never given a chance sometimes. Sometimes even, again, don't shoot the boots me, sometimes we just medicate. It's not really a healthcare system anymore. Sometimes it can be deemed as a sick care system. Sometimes we just medicate. Or sometimes people choose to medicate themselves into oblivion, because they've no idea of this stuff. So we bring this stuff to them. And then concept 4 is skills. Invitation, 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 I have here on my notes, because everything is invitational. There are 6 skills, which is brilliant. Trauma resiliency model I mentioned earlier is for healthcare professionals, pretty much the same as CRIM, but it has 3 additional skills. The CRIM has the 6. There's tracking. We always start with tracking. Then resourcing, grounding, help now, gesturing, shift and stay. And even Elaine Miller-Carris will talk about this, that she stands on the shoulders of others before her. The Peter Levines and my favourite Eugene Gendlin. He was the one that pioneered this whole kind of felt sense and the focusing. Because what we do with the skills, it's an inside out, interoception, felt sense approach. Again, it works beautifully with Elena's look behind and then look within. Put the 2 together. Because in the short term, the skills are designed to help reduce initial distress. That's why they work beautifully, these skills, because they're short term and they can be instantaneous. The longer term, then, like myself, you can embed them and make them a part of your everyday life, as I have done, particularly with tracking. We remove the complexity of science into understandable concepts. So tracking does what it says on the tin. It's noticing or paying attention to what's happening inside your body at the present moment. Not always easy when you're stressed or traumatized, I know that. But we have to take a step on this because the body holds the score. So we look at sensations of distress and wellness. And it's about what you pay attention to. You can choose internally what you pay attention to. And tracking and returning then your autonomic nervous system to balance. So we do spend time looking at sensations. We call those pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. And I get it, sometimes people's sensations could even be numbness and they really don't want to go there. But ignoring it does not help. because it will implode. The body chatters all the time. It's chattering to you now. It's chattering to me. It was certainly chattering to me this morning before I was doing this. And I had to pull on my tracking big style today, folks, to be able to get me through this. I'm just very hand on heart. I tell it like it is. But the focus again is this: controlling. Take back, choice, change, control, compassion and responsibility for you. And CRIM helps us to do that. Resource. I'm going to invite you. As I say, it's always inviting. And I'm a bit of a control freak. I used to say years ago, I need you to do this. And then someone said, Mags, get to grips. It has to be invitational. So I'm going to invite you to maybe have a little think of what a resource might look like for you. So resourcing is the second skill that we usually lean into. It's inviting you to pick one for yourself. A resource is anything, a person, a place, a thing, a memory, a hero, something inside of you, something outside of you that helps you feel calm or pleasant, a good memory. So resourcing of mine is really simple, but sharing again is sitting of an evening with a glass of wine, watching my favourite Agatha Christie, Poirot and Martles. I mean, that's it all day long for me. It can be as simple as that. But here's the difference with the resourcing, because we spend a lot of time looking at resourcing. And this is where my coaching comes actually to life, because the difference with these skills is that you use a coaching mentality with them. Because as well as talking to me about your resource, I'm then asking you, what are you noticing on the inside? What do you see in there as you're talking to me about that? What do you hear? Because your body will tell you. What exactly does that feel like, that experience, or that person, or that memory? And okay, we can lean in a safe space sometimes too, because resources, even when they're good, if they've, say, a past loved one, and then we can start to feel a bit distressed. But that's okay, because then it's about, well, where do you feel distress? And how about moving to a place within you that feels calmer? Because trust me, the distress won't be everywhere. Or how about I sit with you for a while you feel the distress and you feel those sensations without allowing them to overwhelm you or allowing them to frighten you. Let's actually start to stand up to some of the sensations that you're feeling that you've been running away from. Help now. It's giving you 3 today. This is the quickest one, the run with it, the impactful, the immediate one. This is the one that was a great skill for the staff and volunteers and victim support. There's lots of skills in there, as you can see. But can you imagine being a staff or volunteer, and probably, you know, teach a lot of you to suck eggs, but imagine being a witness service volunteer and your client's up in court, victim of crime, and you've got to get them into court to give their evidence. Or imagine you're a community service volunteer and your client has become a victim of crime in the last couple of days. And they're now front and centre, they're now in front of you, and you're just about to give them and take them through emotional and practical support. Stress will be dictating very much in those situations. The lid has flipped. The stress response system is on. We are hypervigilant. So there's no logic, there's no analytical decision making, there's no social skills present because the frontal lobes have now dislocated, they've gone offline. But what can I do to get this person in and giving best evidence? What can I do to get them through an emotional and practical support session so that I can get them thinking just that little bit clearer for me? Well, the Help Now skills have been brilliant. The difference again is that when we do them, because people can say, but sure, I do that and I've done that, and yeah, I take a glass of water, yeah, I take a cup of tea. The difference is it's tied in with the coaching mentality. I will sit with you, or when I go off kilter myself sitting at my desk sometimes and I lose it when I'm on my own, or I do get stressed or things bump me out, I know to get up and go for a glass of water, have a cup of tea, or go outside and listen to the birds, or look at 6 colours that I can see when I'm walking the dog. But the difference is, rather than the mindfulness movement as well, which is a great movement, it's about what am I noticing on the inside while that's happening. So in the pit of my stomach, when it's churning, I don't run away from it, but I'm noticing it now, more so the nuances of that. I'm noticing what's triggering me. But oh, hey ho, my tummy is flipping, but funny enough, my chest feels quite warm. Interesting. Wouldn't have thought about that a second ago. So what is the body telling me? You'll be glad to know I'm nearly finished. I have a couple of resources again, because it's all about knowledge, knowledge, knowledge. You take it, then run with it if it tickles your fancy. There is a brilliant iChill app. So it guides you in the use of the CRIM, wellness skills. It includes simple information about how stress affects the mind and body. And of course, we have the Building Resilience to Trauma, Elaine Miller-Karras's book. You have the traumaresourceinstitute.com. You've just got to message them. Again, we can take this offline because I'm not sure with regards to timings, the depth of questions sometimes. I wouldn't be sure. I think I'm more or less on point with my time. I think it might be 1 minute over as well. But I do thank you for that. If the questions, again, in my honesty, are too high level and too much, I am more than happy to take them offline and get a really good yarn with you. And we could have a cup of tea online or face-to-face, not a problem. If you're interested in some CRIM workshops, you can go to ASCERT and we can book in some CRIM sessions for you if you're interested at all. But again, folks, thank you so much for your time. And I am now going to breathe.
Thank you so much.
In through the nose and out through the mouth. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Mag. So you've actually kind of run in through and past your Q&A time, unfortunately. So we'll just give you, I'll give you a couple of quick questions there before we turn it over to Kevin for close. And there's one question in the Q&A that I would say you might want to take a look at to sort of answer separately. It might be a question that might involve too much time, unfortunately, at this point. But I will ask you the sort of brief question. So you have one here. So is the training for CRM for one-to-one use, is it online or is it delivered within Northern Ireland?
The CRIM for one-to-one use can be online or face-to-face, can be done both.
Okay, perfect. And then the last question I'll give you here. So if CRM is targeted at the neurological system, does it have a fit or role with conditions such as epilepsy?
That I would have to take offline. I couldn't answer that just right off the top of my head, but I'd be more than happy to take that offline.
Perfect. And then, like I said, the other question that's for you there, I would say I would take a look at that separately. And just another, can clients use the iChill app? That's meant for
100%. 100%. Get it downloaded and have a whiz through it. Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, again, thank you so much for that, Mags. And again, clearly, Mags is happy to take questions offline. So if you need her contact information, you can always contact myself to provide that to you, or Mags can throw it into the Q&A if she has the type answer button there. But I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kevin then for our closing remarks.
Thanks, Elena, and thanks, Mags and Orla and Deirdre. I think what's clear today is that all of our speakers could go on for a long time talking about this area, and there's so much passion in it. And I think it makes me think about ourselves. You know, many of us, if not all of us, will have experienced trauma at some point in their life, or at least know someone that has. And that might be a single incident or at a point in time, or perhaps multiple events over sustained time. Feelings of guilt, shame, fear, and possibly others, coupled with societal stigma, may impact us both personally and indeed professionally. And regardless of our professional role we might find ourselves in, we're often responding from that position of what Val Woskett calls the wounded healer. And as children and as adults, my sense is that we need what Dan Siegel refers to as the 4 S's to foster secure attachment. You know, our children need to be seen, not just seeing with the eyes, but also perceiving them deeply and empathically. They need to be safe, where we avoid actions and responses that frighten them or hurt them. They need to be soothed, where we can help them deal with difficult emotions and situations. And they need to be secure, where we can help them develop an internalized sense of well-being. Many of our speakers have talked about these things today with different language. Many of us, though, haven't received those 4 S's in childhood, and therefore we may need to reparent our inner child to ensure that we have enough of those 4 S's enough of the time as adults to support our well-being. And whether we're children, adolescents or adults, we would all greatly benefit, I think, from what Peter Levine describes as being the empathic witness. As trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside us in the absence of that empathic witness. And having an empathic witness also recognises that we need to consider the impact of ACEs in the context of a life course approach. And that's going to include considering both asset and strength-based methods. Such methods acknowledge that an adult's neurobiology isn't predetermined by childhood alone, but yet impacted by it. Being trauma-informed supports a balanced approach to using evidence-based practice and acknowledging the unique strengths that individuals have while meeting their idiosyncratic needs. And one of my favorite quotes comes from Gabor Mate, which reflects this piece. And he talks about the fact that not all addictions are rooted in abuse or trauma, but I do believe they can all be traced to painful experiences. A hurt is at the center of all addictive behaviors. It is present in the gambler, the internet addict, the compulsive shopper, the workaholic. The wound may not be as deep and the ache may not be as excruciating, and it may not even be entirely hidden, but it's there. And as we'll see, the effects of early stress or adverse experiences directly shape both the psychology and the neurobiology of addiction in the brain. So we've heard this morning about recognising and responding to trauma, and it's an integral part of achieving those better outcomes. And that is achieved through the implementation of a trauma-informed practice. And as Orla highlighted, with links to existing priorities, we need to consider that adversity and trauma from a workplace and an organisational perspective. And in doing so, that helps us understand our own responses and our own needs. The prevalence of adversity and trauma means that we do not only focus on the people who seek the support, but also equally on the people and the systems who provide that support. We need to be thinking about a whole person. And that trauma-informed practice can only happen in the context of trauma-informed and trauma-responsive environments, policies, systems, and organisations. In a phrase, a whole system approach to this work. And we know and recognise that there's much to do in achieving a whole system approach. And as Jazz outlined in the earlier TED talk, we need to humanise our approach and ability as everyday's heroes. And in doing so, we probably benefit greatly from what Donald Winnicott described back in the 50s as good enough. And acknowledging that starting position from which to build awareness and build action. And perhaps maybe some of the questions that Aidan asked of us this morning to consider at the very beginning of the webinar have enabled you to consider your understanding from a different vantage point. I'd like to thank you for your attendance today, and also know that some of the information you heard will be new, and for others it will hopefully have helped organise that existing knowledge, skills and experience you already have. I'm hopeful that the webinar has stimulated some additional creativity and thought, and perhaps you might even make yourself a commitment to follow up on any new learning post this webinar. I would really like to thank each of our speakers today: Aidan Dawson from the Public Health Agency, Orla Connolly from the Safeguarding Board Northern Ireland, Deirdre McLaughlin from Connected for Life, Elena Brewer from ASCERT, Margaret Maggs Johnston from Discover UNI, and a huge big thank you to the team behind the event, Jim McConaughey, Elena Brewer and Colin Robinson, and from whom without their support today's webinar would not have been possible, so thank you. I would encourage you to enjoy the rest of your day as you move back into that. And also, if you have an opportunity, take some time for reflection, some self-compassion. You're going to receive a follow-up email tomorrow with a short evaluation, and I encourage you to complete and return the evaluation. We value all feedback, good, bad, and different, and would also be keen to hear your views around future events and work in this area and what that could look like. And I genuinely hope that we can continue engagement in this very important area of work as the Public Health Agency begins to adopt a trauma-informed approach over the coming months and years. So thank you very much, folks, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Again, just a final thank you for myself as well on behalf of ASCERT. Really hope that you enjoyed today. If you have any questions following today, if you are interested in connecting with any of today's speakers, you can please email me at elena@assert.biz, ELENA@assert.biz, and I would be happy to answer any inquiries as you have. I will take a look, I will have a discussion with the speakers to see if they are happy enough to share any of the slides that they had today or any other information. I will check in with them about that. And as I said at the very beginning of today, there will be a recording made available for today. So we will communicate with you in the coming days when we have that available for you. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for today. I hope you really enjoyed it. And as Kevin said, I hope you have a relaxing rest of your day and a good start to the rest of your week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.